So in the event of a fire or other emergency, you should vacate the building in an orderly manner through the nearest available exit, which I assume would be that one, and make your way through the main door to the fire assembly points in the car park. Thank you. I'll just give it another minute and then we'll do the live stream. Right, Alfie, can we have the live stream started, please, and confirmation that we are recording? Thank you.
No, confirm, Chair, that we are now live.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Environment and Sustainability Scrutiny Committee of the 20th of January. I'm Louis Stark and I'm your chair. The agenda papers and other relevant information for this meeting are available for public viewing on the Herefordshire Council website. The Council is streaming this meeting live on the Herefordshire Council YouTube channel and also making a recording. The recording will be available via the Council's website shortly after the meeting has concluded. I'll jump across the other one because we've got no attendees today from the public. Please could attendees who are in the room keep background noise to a minimum and ensure that mobile phones and other devices are turned to silent. Could you also, for those of you who have laptops on, make sure that your laptop is muted for any email alerts that might come through and to avoid the ding. To ensure that recording quality is maintained and contributions be heard clearly, could attendees speak directly into the microphones? For those of you who have maybe not used the microphones before, the right hand button is the live button for the microphone. I normally introduce everyone who's at the meeting today for the benefit of those that are actually looking in. I'll start with the committee members. Today we have Councillor Pebbody, who's the Vice Chair, Councillor Thomas, Councillor Heathfield, Councillor Davis, Councillor Proctor, welcome because you are substituting for Councillor Owen, and Councillor Highfield back from his 2-month trip to Australia, and I'm glad you're back safely. From the Cabinet, we have Councillor Swinglehurst, who's the Deputy Leader and the Lead for the Environment, Officers Ben Boswell and Liz Duberley, and I'm very grateful to see 3 outside attendees to help us with scrutiny today. Andrew McRobb from the Countryside Charity, formerly the CPRE, Stephen Klink from Farm Herefordshire, and Mary Albright from the Confederation of Independent House Builders Lobby Group. Okay, you're all most welcome. Clark, we'll go on to the agenda now and we'll start with item 1. Have we any apologies for absence today?
We received apologies from Councillor Robert Owens.
And substitutes, we now have Councillor Proctor.
Councillor Ben Proctor is substituting, yeah.
Do members have any declarations of interest for the item on the agenda today? No, that's fine. I now come to the minutes, item 4. For those of you who are in attendance at the meeting in November, I know.
Sorry, just I don't know if there's declaration of interest, but it's in my notice of interest. I'm a member of the Herefordshire Wildlife Trust. Okay. They're obviously going to come up in this conversation.
Well, thanks for letting us know that, Councillor Proctor. I don't think there's any problems with Councillor Proctor still engaging in the debate. No. All right. Going on to the minutes of the meeting in November. For those who were in attendance, the meetings have been circulated. And if you're happy for me to sign these the minutes, could you indicate by show of hands now? Thank you. And of course, Councillor Proctor, you went there, so you are abstaining. Fine. Item 5, Clark. Do we have any questions from members of the public today?
No questions have been received.
Thanks. Item 6. Do we have any questions from members of the council today?
No questions have been received from council members.
So that means we move on to item 7, which is our substantive item today on water quality in the River Lug. I should just thank officers for the report that they have provided on this particular topic today, and also the embedded links which I read with interest. I should also say, committee members, although our primary focus today will be on the River Lug, I think because of the wider impacts that we're interested in, including the economic impacts, I think we'll be touching upon the rivers Arrow and Frome as well as main tributaries of the Lug. But we can actually tease that out when we come to the actual debate itself. But before we go into the background of all of that, I want to remind us of the 4 objectives that we have agreed for the scrutiny today, because I will structure the discussion around those 4 objectives. Normally, for those of you who have not been at my particular committee meetings before, I normally allow for about 2 hours for the debate, and then I have a 20-minute break to consider recommendations, and then I bring the committee back then to agree them. Can we have the objectives are there? Yeah, I'll read them out to you. The objectives we've agreed for today, and where we see the River Lug, I would also like to read in the Arrow and the Frome as well. Receive an update on the current apportionment of the sources of nutrient overload on the River Lug. Understand progress in delivering the special plan for the River Wye. And I understand, Councillor Swinglehurst, you had a meeting with the ministers last month, so you can update us on that, because I think there may have been developments there. Update on activity to improve the water quality of the River Lug and evaluate the progress on developing new wetland areas or river improvement and their impact on house development. And finally, to further understand the environmental, social and economic impacts of poor water quality and pollution in the River Lug, including the ability to plan and build new housing. I will start using my discretion as chair. I was interested to read all the background papers, but I didn't really get a clear picture of exactly what area in Herefordshire is covered by the moratorium. Is there anyone that could help here in terms of just at least outlining to the committee, particularly in terms of the impact on the 3 rivers I've mentioned, exactly where the moratorium bites? Do we know? Mary, do you want?
So there is a map produced by the council, which is actually borrowed over from the first moratorium from 2015-ish, 2016. And it's effectively about 40% of the north of the county. 40% of the north of the county. There's a little tiny bit at the very top, which is out of the Arrow, Lug and Frome, but it comes right down to the border to Hereford City. But there is a map. It's got a red zone and a purple zone, and then unaffected white zones. But it's the red zone that is the Lug that's under moratorium.
So it's a fairly massive area that it covers then at the moment.
It's a huge, vast, geographically vast, yeah.
In terms of the 3 rivers themselves, the Lug, the Arrow and the Frome, is it the whole section of each of those rivers that flow in Herefordshire that's covered by the moratorium?
That's a good question, but I think there's a kind of an umbrella understanding that the Lug is that red zone. You probably could drill down now into specific catchments, so kind of sub-catchments of the sub-catchment, which might give a more realistic picture of the conditions that are actually being tested.
I mean, that's the one thing I want to tease out today. We're looking at a sub-catchment area of the Wye. So if we start talking about the Wye, that's all very well and very good for context. But what we need to look at is the specific issues around this particular sub-catchment. I think that's an important point here.
Yeah, and the agencies have been very clear in probably the last 3 or 4 Nutrient Management Board meetings that the Wye is not failing. It is specifically the Lug. And they've carried that through now to their kind of defining the area as the Lug nutrient neutrality area. But perhaps one point to reference is that the Lug that is in Wales isn't under moratorium. So the Lug does cross over the border, but only the Herefordshire part is under housing restrictions.
Yeah. Councillor Swinglehurst, do you want to say anything at this point about that to help the committee?
Yeah, I think we've sent an actual map to help with the understanding. It's a really good question. It always staggers me actually the geographically vast area that we're talking about when we talk about, because in your mind you can think the Wye is the big area and the Lug is a tributary side. It's a really big area. It has a huge impact.
The other thing I wanted to ask about, because obviously it's Natural England that is actually assessing the actual health of the river, and it's been obviously classed as unfavourable failing. Do we know how frequently the Natural England do these assessments on the river?
Every 3 years.
Every
3 years.
2 years?
And it is interesting to note in the context of the unfavourable declining, the change of condition, that it's the lug that has water quality as one of the reasons for that change, not the why. The why it's white claw crayfish, salmon, and macrophytes. But the lug, it's water quality, as well as the others.
And what about the arrow and the foam?
It includes as part of the catchment.
It is the whole
But they have
catchment.
got different. Yeah, I mean, you're right to sort of, be looking at it in terms of how do we pick it apart rather than just look, because the targets are different, obviously, for the lug and for the Y, because they're recognising the different conditions of the two rivers, and also the arrow and the foam have different challenges as well, and quite specific challenges in terms of the history of hop growing. I think is a particular issue on the foam, and there are different levels and impacts in those rivers as a result. So, in a sense, when you're talking about the condition or the amount of phosphate in the river, it varies from place to place and river to river.
Liz?
Yeah, so Natural England set the targets as to what is an acceptable level of nutrients within the watercourse. And as Councillor Swinger has said, that varies from river to river according to the kind of ecology, geology, etc. conditions of the river. Yeah.
So I mean, if it helps, I've got the site targets for the lug is 0.0241 milligrams per litre, and the arrow is 0.03, and the foam is 0.03. So it's in acknowledgement of the different conditions of those rivers and what is judged to be required.
But, I mean, I'll bring in other committee members shortly. But what I'm trying to get at here is understanding what the process is by which we would see a lifting of the moratorium. I don't want to jump ahead to some of the other objectives that we're going to look at later on, but I'm just trying to get an idea of the evidence base and what needs to change in that evidence base in order for something to actually happen here. Because I will be going on to housing targets and growth later on, as Councillor Swingos would expect. But it's that evidence base, and I'm just not clear in my own mind, I'm sure the committee aren't either, exactly what needs to happen in order to get all the ducks in a row, as it were, on the rivers, to actually then, for Natural England to say, fine, we can go back to just normal planning in that particular area. Liz?
So the monitoring is undertaken by the Environment Agency, and the condition of the river is kind of reviewed on a 3-year basis, taking into account all of the monitoring figures, and it's aligned with the JNCC guidance. So they follow that guidance as to how they set the targets and assess the condition. So essentially the River Wye was downgraded to unfavourable declining in the last review, and that's because they hadn't seen at that point in time the progress and improvement. However, they're still kind of monitoring in the interim, and the informal feedback is that we can see a small level of recovery within the Wye, for example.
Andrew?
If I can just add, as part of the Y Alliance, particularly for the lug, you heard that the targets are 0.03 or 0.03 or 0.02. The average readings in there are now 0.3, so we are massively over the targets that are set in the lug catchment. And to be honest, all the data that we have, and that includes a recent report from Lancaster University and everything that we're doing, we're showing that there is no ability currently on the steps that we're taking to reduce those levels that would allow it to have favourable status and lift the moratorium. I think the only way the moratorium is going to be lifted in the short term is a change in policy rather than a change in targets, for whatever reasons that the policy may need to be changed. But I think we need to take that on board, that There is nothing happening currently that is reducing the levels of pollution, and in fact we are still increasing the levels of pollution. Sorry to have such a sad note to put into the debate.
Alyssa, yeah.
Yes, Andrew, I was completely right. The moratorium, you can either try and fix the river, and the moratorium would, as a natural consequence, be lifted, but there isn't a direct relationship between the moratorium, i.e. new house building, and the condition of the river. So that's a conundrum, and it is in legislation that the problem arises because of the Dutch cases, which specify that you cannot make a negative impact on a protected an SAC of any, even the smallest amount, and so that's where we are. So the government is looking at that. They are looking at the appropriateness of that, and that will require that they have to look at the habitats regulations and see, is there some way that they can be changed in order that mitigation can be somewhat, a more strategic, broader project. But what is worth bearing in mind is looking at the modelled. So just to give you all a sort of sense of this, that if we look at the modelled numbers, by the time AMP7 and 8, so this is the planned investment by the water company, by the time that they're invested, and this is current work being undertaken, the housing sector has achieved, it has then got zero reduction required to achieve compliance. So it's done its bit. But the diffuse element, which is principally agriculture, is 82.37% of the problem. So the nutrients in the river would be remaining broadly the same, but housing has got nothing left to give. It's down to zero, and so that's that. You have to always look at the two things together, and in terms of getting the river to favourable conservation status. But in relieving the moratorium, you can see that there's no point at which housing can fix the river. It just can't do it. It's not possible.
Councillor Heathfield, then Councillor Proctor, then Councillor Highfield.
I just wanted to come back to data quickly. So I've been one of the volunteer data people collecting river water and testing it on 3 points on the River Frome. And I've been really encouraged to see that data being collected by Andrew's team and being shared with the Environment Agency. I've been along to events where we've seen the map of the whole, that red zone, and the data points for each of them. And where I have been testing is the second worst place in the whole of that Lug catchment. Little Lug is the worst. My section of the River Frome was the second worst, and it's not. I just want to say it's not getting better. Just repeat again what Andrew said. I've had to take a break from taking the readings because I just found it too upsetting. Just it constantly getting worse. So my point in saying that is the data is there. We've got that data. Those volunteers are going out and doing that, and that is much more valuable than anything that happens on a 2 or 3 year cycle. It's weekly information, and it's incredibly valuable, and it's brilliant those volunteers are doing it. And I would love it if that data could be shared more widely, on the Herefordshire Council website, anywhere where it could be hosted, to make sure that people are seeing that, and it has an impact on every kind of decision maker, because there are so many people involved in this. So I wondered why that evidence hadn't been brought forward to us today, whether there were any difficulties with that, and I'd really like maybe for us to start all seeing it regularly. And is there anything that's needed to keep that data collection sustainable through the future, and is there any recommendation that we can make that would help that? So I'd really like to hear, especially from Andrew, on that. And then there's also just, that the moratorium being lifted doesn't seem to be like the big point to me here. I think we need to check that the wetland scheme is working and that developers are feeling that they're able to take that up, that we've got the use of private mitigation schemes right, and that the enforcement of that and the lifetime measurement of that is going to work for everyone. But then it's, what is happening with the farmers? We've had no evidence today about the extent to which farming rules for water are actually being followed, the extent to which regulations are being followed, and the Environment Agency's indicative catchment statistics were very clear that even if every single farmer was completely following all of those recommendations and rules, that would only be achieving half of the reduction that land use needs to achieve. So what is it that we need to be applying our joint imaginations to support farmers to create that further reduction? That's what the rivers need. That's what we all need. And that's what I'm looking forward to getting out of this meeting, and maybe our follow-up meeting on land use.
If there is any recommendation you want to make about the evidence base needing to be expanded upon, then by all means do so, because this is the time to do that. If you
That's
can.
why I want to hear from Andrew what's
Okay,
needed, really.
Okay.
I can easily respond to that. All of our data is readily available. It's on a website that any member of the public can actually see, and a thing called YViz. I think that YViz is quite a complex place to find all the data, but you can find it for individual sampling points, for whole rivers, and for whole catchments. It may well be that there is an opportunity to take some of that data that's already there, and for Herefordshire Council to embed that in regular reports about the catchment. It exists. We'd be very happy to work with you on that subject.
Do you want to come in now, Liz, before?
Yeah, if I can, please. Happy to look at whether that data could be included on the Herefordshire Council website, but I think it is important to note that the Environment Agency and Natural Resources Wales do already take into account that monitoring. So the review that takes place, and whilst the review is on that sort of 3-year basis, there is much work done in the interim period. So all of that monitoring is taken into account and feeds into that kind of overarching review as well. So, it is valuable information.
But I still think it's quite useful to have a recommendation from this committee just to reinforce the point, because if the information could be published on our website as well, then it's more available then, isn't it, Liz?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Ben?
I was just going to say, I mean, if we could do that quicker than a recommendation, if you want us just to do that. But well, up to you if you want to make one, but we can make, if we just signpost to it immediately, we could do that very quickly.
Just make sure we've got it as a point in the minutes then?
Yeah.
Scrutiny officer, yeah?
Okay.
Okay, we'll make sure, Helen, we've got it as a point in the minutes, and then we can actually monitor it and make sure that is actually delivered. Ben?
Most of my questions were actually much less well-informed version of Councillor Heathfield's questions, but I can't resist jumping in on a conversation about data. So I feel like there's something in this conversation about who sees the data, how is it available, but I would be wary of just jumping to let's put it on the council website. I think this is my day job, so I'm always going to say it's much more complicated than that. But I think kind of understanding a bit more about who might want to use the data for what purpose and what barriers are there currently to getting hold of that, and there will be different barriers for different people. So rather than just jumping to let's spin up a council webpage, just a bit more of a process to understand like who needs that data, who already gets it, and where's the gap. But what I haven't heard is what I thought was one of Councillor Heathfield's questions, which is about what more do we need to do to get the agricultural sources down beyond that 50% if everybody follows the those recommendations.
Just before you come in, Liz, obviously council members use the website, and I don't see any harm if the data is at least explained. I mean, what you're saying is it is quite a complicated piece of data. If it's explained, because we as council members will use the website to get access to it as well.
Yeah, I don't want to sidetrack this into a whole nerdy conversation about data, but there are, you could stick spreadsheets on the website. They may be published via APIs. You might consume the API and put that on a slippy. Like there are many ways in which you can make data available, make it more useful to people, and so just putting it on the website is insufficient kind of solution, I would say.
Well, we'll note that in the minutes. I don't know did you want to come in, Liz, or first of all?
So I was only going to respond to some of the earlier questions that were kind of tied up in your earlier comment around the efficacy of the wetlands and around the data that's coming forward. So I can pick up on that, or if there was any further response to the data.
Well, my only thought about the data is that the YVIS site is interactive, it's open source, so it's already out there, it's already publicly available. All we could do is we could put a link to it and just make sure that it's signposted. Here is a link to the citizen science data being gathered. We make no
a link there, yes.
further protestation about it, but it's if anyone's really interested in, I think I can't even remember how many tens of thousands of data points there are on it now. It's incredible.
May I just add that I think there's a valid point about it's no point just putting data up there. The data we have is vast, but I do think that perhaps a regular summary of that data would be beneficial, and then with the link to the data itself, because that would give councillors and anyone a better idea of what's happening. And one of the strategic reasons I think that's important is that I think we will be heading towards a position that we need a government policy shift to actually enact the changes that we've just been talking about, such as the how do we get a bigger reduction. There are at least one country in Europe where that's happening, but that's had massive government intervention. And I think that that's the only way we're actually going to get that. So the better we can educate everyone, including councillors, including the public, that will actually provide, if you like, an impetus to actually get the change that's necessary. Because if we keep quiet about it, nothing's ever going to happen. Thank you.
On that point, and just to finish this particular piece of the debate, you'd be happy to provide a summary to Herefordshire for the website? Ben, would that be a suitable compromise?
I'm sure that would be helpful.
Okay, thanks. Before I bring Councillor Highfield in, would you wanted to talk about this particular point as well?
No.
Okay, Councillor Robert.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'd like to compliment Councillor Heathfield in highlighting what are the key points. And every time we approach this subject, it's complicated. We all know it's complicated, but we can simplify. And one of the key things she's pointed out and has been confirmed here is that even if we do everything that's been laid down, we're only going to get halfway towards reducing the thing. And that is a simple number. And what we need to do is to have specific measures that will achieve it. Councillor Proctor referred to that too. We need specific measures that will achieve the objective because it is an unshakable objective. And secondly, currently the effort all seems to be based on the moratorium, and yet we also know that housing is no longer the blame for it and cannot contribute to the solution. Even if we remove the moratorium tomorrow with current building standards, we are not going to increase measurably the pollution in the catchment because simply we build in a way that will no longer allow that pollution to get into the rivers. And then there's such a lack of logic from the Environment Agency. Let me refer briefly to the why. They fail it based on the wildlife records about white-clawed crayfish and salmon. But let's look at how illogical that is? The red-clawed crayfish, the invasive species, are doing really well in the Wye, and so are a lot of fish species. The salmon have to survive in the Atlantic, swim up the Bristol Channel, and spawn successfully in Wales. Is it our Wye River that's causing the loss of? They don't know. So there's no logic to that. And in my own planning application, I was proposing a solution to a toilet as part of a tiny planning application that would have reduced the tiny amount of pollution that my toilet might have contributed to zero. But that wasn't acceptable under current planning rules because all toilets have to be connected to the main sewage system. They have to be. And if the main sewage system can't cope, then where are we? And I was proposing an alternative way that would remove it completely, 100%, and that's not acceptable. So we've got this illogical background. And meanwhile, nobody can say, we have to do this, this, and this if you want to get the pollution down to an acceptable level. And that's what we need. That's what we need to focus on. We need to be able to have a clear target. This is what we must do. Now, how can we do it? And we've not got that, have we? So until we get that, until we get an offered scientifically sound solution to what needs to be done, we're making no progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hurryfield. Councillor Thomas?
Yeah, I can't quite understand why basically we seem to be lying down and having our tummies tickled because the EA are not up with it. Alyssa's just given the figures now, and what everybody's said, if we do away with the moratorium tomorrow, we are not going to increase the phosphate in the lug 1%. So why on earth are we being so, this ought to be main news. We ought to really be getting it in the whatever the Labour paper is, I never remember. But we need to have this very, very public. And we need our leader to be making sure that this article is there. Because they are being totally quite ridiculous in doing this. And the amount of trouble we are going to with all our wetlands, all the expense, all the extra expense we're putting on people like Mary that are trying to construct all this thing. And not only that, this huge amount of money we've already lost. And there would be a percentage of that would have come into the coffers of the council in rates, in various other things. And we just seem to be really doing nothing. And just on the farming, just looking at this chart here, the 72% is blamed on farming. Well, most of you know I was a farmer. The one thing you use least of all, if you can get away with it, is phosphate. Because it's the most expensive of the three main elements you buy. It is by far the most expensive. And most people, most farmers, on my own particular farm, I used it very, very sparingly. And only if we had crops that, for example, cabbages or potatoes, did we ever use any phosphate. Most of the time, the Herefordshire sandstone has sufficient phosphate within it to carry most crops, especially all corn crops and grassland. So, why are we just sort of taking this so lightly?
Okay, I'll bring Mary in now because I think you were trying to get in. I mean, I know you're trying to get in, I know.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned what other ways are there about addressing the moratorium? And I thought I'd just summarise very quickly that there are, from my perspective, there are three mechanisms how that might happen. The first is to bring the catchment into favourable ecological conditions. Now that has proven almost impossible beyond belief. For the 5 years that I've been on the Nutrient Management Board, we've had probably 4 or 5 plans come forward and the actions can't be delivered or nobody wants to do them. We do have the opportunity in the DWPP, which is the Diffuse Water Pollution Plan, which will be published in March. And it's a High Court ordered plan from, I think the order was originally in 2014, Liz will remember. So it's been a hugely delayed plan. The Environment Agency write it, and that legally must have actions to return favourable conditions. So we've all been waiting on bated breath for this, and I have put myself into a point of extreme patience waiting for this information to come forward. At the Nutrient Management Board, we asked for an update and we were told that wasn't possible because it wasn't something they wished to share until the point of publication, which I think Alyssa, Liz, Andrew, Steve and I found that quite bizarre, that the Nutrient Management Board, who will have to, if you like, oversee the plan, won't see it until it's published, which worries me. So point one, you could put the catchment back into favourable conditions through an action plan that delivered the conditions. The other way is you could look at the data. So the apportionment data is very, very clear now that housing has done, there are three phrases that are adopted by the government for ecological decisions. One is a threshold of significance, the other is the polluter pays, and the third is a fair share contribution. The apportionment data very clearly shows that all of those tests have been met. So housing and Welsh Water are within that, have done more than their fair share, and they do not need to reduce their contribution any further. In Welsh Water's defence, they've been doing this for 10 years, not just kind of the last period of AMP. So it's a long time, and millions of pounds, hundreds of millions of pounds of investment have gone into doing that. But also Herefordshire, we don't build very many houses. So it would be perfectly natural to realise that housing isn't the contributor. Existing housing, 88,000. New housing used to be around about 700 a year. So we're talking tiny numbers spread across the fourth biggest county in the country. But the other way that could be done is that there is a Water Act or Water Bill now where the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act is part of this, where every other authority or area with a failing catchment has the benefit of a bill that says by 2030 your water company will be assumed to have done all the upgrades required to protect housing from being a polluter. Now Herefordshire doesn't have the benefit of this because under devolution our water company is Welsh owned and operated. So we are the only area that cannot access the LURA bill. Now the benefit of that is A, your water company are under an obligation to do it legally and they must do that work. In Herefordshire, Welsh Water have already done it, so we'd be in a better position. But it also means your mitigation only needs to be provided until 2030. So you can do more mitigation for more houses, but for less cost. And by 2030, it's assumed that the water company are doing their job, which we're already in that position, but we can't use it because we are our water company are a Welsh entity. So we are being disadvantaged by an act of devolution, which I believe is illegal. But that's a complicated way. I think if you went on the apportionment, the moratorium should be lifted. And I would, if you were minded to make a recommendation, it would be that the Chief Executive and the Leader of the Council write to the agencies and to the government to say that we believe we're in a position now where housing has done more than its fair share under the threshold of significance and the polluter isn't paying. Sorry, it's a bit of a rant there.
As a chair, I often use my discretion from where we get recommendations from, Mary. And if you're happy to put a draft along those lines now to the scrutiny officer, we will consider it, yes. I think that's a fair point. Councillor Peverday, because you've been waiting patiently.
So we've learnt that development was a small contributor to point source pollution of the river, and that in the period of the moratorium, mitigation steps were taken and that was improved. So my concern and my question is, if the moratorium is lifted, how are we going to continually check that pollution levels don't rise again, especially when there are so many private mitigation systems that we as a council don't have control over, like the wetland system? Is there a danger that if we lift the moratorium, then things are going to slip again?
Are you referring to kind of future projected growth? Are you kind of like, if we were to meet the new housing targets, what would that mean for? Yeah.
Well, that and also mitigation systems that are put in now and that perhaps won't be checked over their lifetime. I know there's certain restrictions, there's plans that we need to see about how they're going to be managed over their lifetime, but I'm not sure there's anything in place about how we check that they are still not contributing to pollution over their lifetime.
So, well, Liz probably know, yeah.
So, yeah, there's a lot in there. So in terms of the wetlands, we are required to monitor and maintain for an 80-year period as part of the strategic mitigation, which we do. And for the first 12 months, we've had an independent consultant undertaking that monitoring on our behalf and testing within the lab. And what it has shown is that The difference in phosphate level between the inlet and the outlet point is a reduction in 70%, averaged out over that 12-month period. So we are confident that this nature-based solution with its fluctuations is delivering that phosphate reduction. The housing that we've released from the phosphate credits generated from the wetlands is, from last week's figures, 769 dwellings. And we have allocated further credits to planning applications on the allocations list. And we are at the point now of the two wetlands we're allocating credits from, so that's Luston and Tarrington, and that has addressed almost all of the current allocations list. So up to 2023, we have 19 kilos remaining that we've yet to allocate because we're just working through the process. So I would say that is a success in terms of kind of addressing that housing backlog. We are bringing forward further schemes, so we're bringing forward an upgrade to a PTP and a third wetland site. So that it's anticipated that will address all of the entire backlog up to the current position, as well as consider part of the future allocation. I mean, it's certainly true that the allocation, the housing allocation now has grown to 27,000 approximately, and we will need to consider that in our mitigation going forward. But I'm also aware that MHCLG is bringing forward its proposals for a nature restoration fund, which will require a change in legislation, and it will be a kind of central based pot of funding to put in mitigation where it is considered to be most effective. So we are also working with central government on helping to assist in bringing forward that scheme, and we have asked to act as a pilot on that scheme. So we also need to kind of watch the changes, the legislative changes that are coming forward from central government to address the strategic mitigation.
I'm confident that the council-led mitigation schemes will be very long-term monitored, but it seemed to me from the allocation list that a lot of people are choosing their own private alternate mitigation schemes, and I'm concerned about how those are monitored over the long term.
Yeah, so private mitigation schemes, we do have a small number coming forward, and there is, as part of the planning permission, a condition attached to ensure that monitoring is in place. We are, so for example, on the kind of ones that are using an orchard, there is a management plan in place to ensure the kind of management for the duration of the requirement of the mitigation. And then the other schemes that tend to come forward are the upgrades to the PTPs, and there's also a condition that requires reporting on the PTP itself.
So it's important to note that the private schemes have been incredibly hard to get forward through the council's processing, and one of the reasons for that might be that they are testing it to a very rigorous benchmark on longevity. So I am in the kind of odd position where I bought wetland credits from the council strategic scheme. I've tried to bring forward the closure of a cattle yard, which is directly on a brook, in order to reduce phosphorus that way, and then kind of capture those credits for my own developments. And then also smaller schemes like septic tank replacements and orchard planting off the end of a PTP. All of them have to meet the same benchmark that the wetlands have to do, other than the testing, which I think is a voluntary Herefordshire thing, testing it because they want to know the efficacy of it. But for example, if you're upgrading a septic tank, it's a permanent change. So it's something from a septic tank to a private treatment plant. The output is so vastly different. The idea that it would be of any risk in the future is kind of slightly out of scale. But yes, maybe in 100 years' time, somebody might have blocked their septic tank or their PTP or something like that. But we're talking about such tiny amounts of phosphorus that I don't think we should be putting barriers in place of private mitigation, because these are all benefits, and collectively that benefit adds up. The orchard planting on the end of a septic tank, for example, yes, those trees will probably die, but if there's a condition that you have to replant those trees, you've not only got no phosphorus going into the system whatsoever, you've got a mini orchard. And is there any harm at all in having hundreds of mini orchards across Herefordshire? Absolutely not. Don't put a barrier in place that would stop that happening. It makes it really difficult. The cattle yard I haven't yet got through, but I think there are people that I've shared my information with that have got their private schemes through. You're changing a cattle yard on a brook with its huge phosphorus contribution into a housing development forever. So the change, the upgrade, if you like, is a permanent upgrade. So private mitigation schemes are our way out of the time lag that exists within the council's wetland system. So I agree with Liz that they're something that I pushed for from like 2019 forever, but they aren't the answer because they're so slow. And these houses that, you know, Liz has given you the numbers, those applications were made in 2018, 2017, 2019. There are people that are in housing that they've built and they can't get the mitigation credits for, and they can't move into paying rent. There are families that are in caravans on a site they bought in good faith that can't move into their own properties or start building. So the speed of all of this needs to be rapidly increased and made so much more easy, because these are all good things. There's nothing bad about it.
I'll bring in Andrew now, and then Liz, I think you want to come in as well. Andrew first.
Can I just take us back to some of the comments earlier about agricultural pollution? This is, and I don't wish to degrade anything that's just been said about housing, but we are talking about kilograms of pollutant, of phosphate. We are still putting 2,000 tonnes into the pot of Herefordshire every year through diffuse pollution. So whilst these are really interesting things to talk about a few kilograms, we are actually avoiding the elephant in the room. And I just want to quote, just recently, last week, the Office of Environmental Pollution brought out a report. I'm going to read one sentence to you. The prospect of meeting long-term and interim agricultural water targets are largely off track given current policies and measures deployed by the government. And it comes back down to the point that was made. Until we see systems change, and until we can get systems change, we are not going to solve this problem in Herefordshire. We can actually, you know, I think the moratorium is a separate issue, but it's so minor, I don't understand why we're actually still have it. I think we should be building houses. But the elephant in the room is how do we get diffuse pollution down? And it has to be through, you know, I believe, through enormous pressure on government to change things, because otherwise we cannot solve it.
I will be coming on to planning and how we move forward later on in the meeting. I'm going to bring in Councillor Highfield, and then Liz, do you want to answer that point first then? Yes.
I would like to just respond
Okay.
to that if I can. Just to say, you know, recognising what Mary has said about the private mitigation schemes and so on, but we don't operate in isolation, the planning system. We do work with Natural England as the statutory consultee. Any kind of private schemes that we bring forward, they are aligned with the national take, with kind of other local authorities' approach. So we don't consider ourselves to be overly onerous. And obviously Natural England as statutory consultee, if they are not comfortable with our approach, then they will object. So yeah, just wanted to make you aware of that really, but I think it is important to kind of move on and look at some of the kind of wider issues around water quality and river restoration.
I'm planning to do that. Alyssa, you want to come in and then?
Yeah, just to pick up a couple of points, one made by Councillor Thomas, one made by Councillor Highfield, who was saying, well, what is it that needs to happen and why isn't that known? The University of Lancaster Refocus report, which was first published about 3-4 years ago and is going through a reiteration now, but the basic message hasn't really changed. The data and evidence has improved. It's got a bit more nuance, but the scale of change is breathtaking that's required in agriculture. So it is known and it is published. If you look at the first report and then the third report will be broadly consistent with that. And I think it's also coming to the fore in the plan, the DWPP plan, into the scale of change, is making sure that the change is not, everywhere changing everything, because the problem is not everywhere the same. So it makes sense to focus that. But we're talking about change, land use change over about 30%. A huge reduction in the use of artificial fertiliser, a massive reduction in livestock. These are the sorts of things that those reports are talking about. The point that Councillor Thomas was making about how he would not have over-applied his phosphate, very good. Part of the reason this has become an issue is because we have a superabundance in this catchment of a phosphate-rich manure, which has been very easy to get hold of and very, very cheap. And so whilst, you know, back in the day, you would have been very cautious with how much you're using because you're paying a lot for it, when you have a superabundance, highly available phosphate-rich manure, even if you're applying to your nitrate limits, because it has the relatively high amount of phosphate, you will systemically over-apply phosphate, and that accrues over time, and we end up with a very broad problem that's that's now sort of showing in the freshwater environment. So I hope that helps to understand that. Yeah, Andrew's quite right. You know, when we're talking about kilograms, when we're talking about the moratorium, and when we're talking about agriculture, we're talking about tons of excess.
I'll bring in Stephen now, and then I'm conscious, Councillor Highfield, you've been waiting patiently.
Yeah, I think the housing sector, I mean, Mary must be feeling like she's being kicked in the teeth because, you know, the wetlands, my understanding is that they're mitigating a wetland is about 250 kilos of phosphate, which is 0.16 of a kilo on average per house, which is, as Andrew said, is absolutely nothing in the scheme of things. And agriculture, I think the majority of farmers now realise that they are and accept that agriculture is the biggest contributor of phosphate into waters, and that's probably not surprising in that it's the biggest industry in the county and certainly covers the biggest landmass. But I think one of the things that came out of the Refocus report meeting last week was that this is a problem that's been accruing for 150 years, and maybe not at the scale it has done over the last 30 years, but the inputs of phosphate, that graph from agriculture, the inputs are decreasing currently. But when I asked the question of the professor presenting, how long would it be if we applied no phosphate to agricultural land from today, would we see a reduction in phosphate going into the river? He couldn't really answer because it depends on lots of things, soil type, climate, crops that are grown, but probably 50 to 60 years. So I think we need some realism of what is achievable in the short term and how much things are going to change, even with Andrew's systems change. It's not a short-term fix. And if we have a housing moratorium in the county for the next 50 or 60 years, we're probably going to be stuffed, aren't we?
Thank you. Councillor Highfield.
Yeah, just a brief comment on the housing. Just let's not forget that there's a huge backlog of potential applications for housing for that catchment area if the moratorium was listed. So your average number of new housing is not going to be typical of that area. It's going to be a massively increased number. And I feel sorry for the planning department that will have to face that if the moratorium ends, because it'll be like a wall of applications that come in. And the other thing I'd like to comment on what Mary said is I don't think it's reasonable that applications for mitigation, private mitigation schemes can in some cases take 8 years and still not be resolved. I think it would be a reasonable recommendation for this committee to say these things should be speeded up where possible, or refused more quickly if there's a problem with them. And finally, I must acknowledge my lack of knowledge, and I'm glad that Councillor Swinglehurst has reminded me that there is a solution offered. We do know apparently scientifically what we must do, and the fact that it's difficult and probably expensive, we don't have a choice. We've got to implement it. If there's no better plan available, we've got to start. There's no good saying, oh, it's all too difficult, put it off till next year, kick the can down the road. We've got to get on with it. Because if it's going to take 50 years, well, let's make it 50 years from today, not 50 years from 3 years' time. And it's interesting that, you know, CO2 in the atmosphere takes hundreds of years to disappear. So by just stopping, letting it go, we're not going to help climate change that quickly. In the case of CO2, we're going to have to drag it out of the atmosphere somehow. It's the only way to stop the rapid climate change. And I don't know if there's any possibility of dragging the phosphates out of the soil to stop them getting washed into the river. That may be too difficult, but just chuck that one in there.
I do want to move on to the objective around the wider plans here, and because there's been certain comments made by councillors over where do we go from here and how do we get to where we want to get to in terms of a solution, even though there are the challenges of how long it might take, but there might be policy changes that can be done in order to try and speed the process up. But when you talk about your recommendation on planning, Councillor Highfield, is it realistic to actually say we should speed up planning applications? Because that is an operational matter, isn't it?
For the private mitigation schemes, because we've just heard that they're taking many years to be and still not resolved. So that doesn't seem acceptable to me.
Well, if you've got a recommendation, Councillor Highfield, then do pass it on.
The planning be asked to speed up the approval or refusal of private mitigation schemes.
Did you catch that? Okay. Ben. Ben.
I suppose just on that statement, I guess, you know, the council is strongly committed to supporting these. We're working closely to bring them forward, but they need to be able to deliver certainty to the standards that are required and others are looking at as well. As Liz has already said, Natural England, a statutory consultee, we need to make sure they're in place, they have the certainty, they have all of that. And so I think it's a very unfair generalisation that the council is working slowly to support on some of these site-specific complex cases that are being brought forward by others. We're helping to bring them forward, but they need to be able to deliver, if that makes sense. So, I don't know, I'm struggling with that statement that the council is being slow on this. I don't think that's the case.
If I could just come back on that, Mary quoted some cases which don't seem complicated at all. They seem straightforward and they could form a model like orchards. If you've approved one orchard, why should you go through the whole process to approve another orchard? Just say, okay, all orchards, tick the box. Yes, you can do that. And then it's done.
So if I can just respond to that, Councillor Stark. So each application needs to be looked at on its own merits. Each application is required to have a habitats regulations assessment undertaken, to go through the planning process and to have a section 106 if it's off-site provision developed with legal to tie into the strategic mitigation. So we have provided guidance on our website and we are planning to do more in terms of the types of schemes that are acceptable to bring forward. So for example, orchards, upgrades to PTPs. But I'm not aware that there are any applications that are 8 years old that are undetermined that are relating to private mitigation. I'm happy to have that conversation offline. I think it's also important to state that there is an environmental advice service that we have set up specifically to look at private mitigation schemes, and that then provides specialist input from the ecology team on the acceptability of these mitigation schemes that are proposed. We do link in with the Natural Environment and Environment Agency to get their support on those schemes as well. But if we were to bypass the legislation, we would come under scrutiny from Natural England. We wouldn't be able to grant the permission, and if we were to, then in the current position without taking that advice from legal, we could be subject to judicial review. So we just need to be kind of clear about that high bar of the habitats regulations.
Yes, obviously we could go on and on here, but I mean, if a housing development, just to take figures out of the air, we're going to build 50 houses and we're going to put up an orchard with 100 trees in the field to compensate the mitigation. And after a load of work, you say yes. And the next time 50 houses need to be built, you have to go through the whole process again for another 100 tree orchard to be built, and all through the same hoops so that you can get permission. That doesn't make sense.
And that essentially is the proposal by the Ministry of Housing, Levelling Up and Communities to create a central pot by where planning contributions are made by the developers and mitigation is looked at a strategic level. So it's taking it away from that assessment of individual planning applications. You pay into a levy and then mitigation is put in place in where it will have most effect. So that's kind of under proposal at the moment by central government.
So that would, if that goes ahead, that would solve what I proposed.
Essentially, yes.
And it would cut down the amount of time that is spent dealing with private mitigation schemes.
Yeah.
Well then, let's recommend that we support that.
And then I really do want to move on to the wider planning issue that we have raised.
Well, yeah, my point is very much about the Environment Agency and the plans. Is that okay to? Yeah. So I found it very useful in our papers, the blue and green diagram of the plans and the bodies involved, and particularly intrigued by the question marks. So we have the DWPP, the Diffuse Water Pollution Plan, coming from the Environment Agency. I'm just, I suppose, astonished would be one word for how I feel that they're not sharing drafts. And if there's anything that we can do to force a draft to be shared, I would love to know about it. But I guess that's the source of the question mark of HC next to that, that we're not being allowed to look at drafts, we're not being allowed to feed into that. And I just think we should. And then that leads on to the nutrient management plan, which doesn't have a question mark next to it, but obviously depends on the DWPP. And then we have the catchment management plan and a massive question mark next to DEFRA, which again, you kind of have to laugh, otherwise you'd cry, that there's a question mark next to DEFRA when it comes to responsibility for this sort of thing. So you say that, you know, Stephen has said we're waiting for legislation. There needs to be more regulation for there to be this massive systemic change to land use. And we know Herefordshire Council has no power here apart from the planning system. So is there anything we can do? Is there any recommendation that we can make that will have an impact on the Environment Agency about them sharing their emerging plans? And is there anything we can do to just help with this massive change that needs to occur? I'm very aware that we need to do stuff that has never been done before to support, you know, the next agricultural revolution, I suppose, really, is what it's about. So is there anything we can write down here and take on to do as Herefordshire Council that can help? And I am especially looking to Stephen for that advice.
Well, excuse me. Yeah, I think, I mean, we're not unique, and it has happened in other areas. It's happening currently in Denmark, where the government are paying farmers to reduce their stocking numbers. But it's, you know, it is enormous numbers. The Dutch, who have a government which is farmer-led, are putting I think it was 7.9 billion into reducing livestock. But it's big numbers. You know, Mary will tell me how much, or Mary will tell me how much Welsh Water have spent, but it's a drop in the ocean compared to the money that government would need to spend to change agricultural systems. And just by taking livestock out of the equation, you then have to look at, well, what happens to that land? Because it could be you've got a lot of grassland that then gets ploughed up to grow a crop, which then the soil might become more liable to wash into the river. So the solutions have to be carefully thought about, and the sort of unwanted circumstances and what might potentially happen really has to be thought about hard before you just jump to conclusions about reducing livestock.
Well, and just to give an example of that we've already seen happen, the amount of permanent pasture that's been lost in Herefordshire that's mostly been turned to maize has been an absolute disaster for the amount of soil that's going into the rivers.
Yeah, I'm not sure that. I mean, maize is a crop that is rotated around the farm generally. So the permanent pasture that has been ploughed up hasn't all gone into maize. And maize is a relatively small crop area in the county. And actually, on the flip side, there's the amount of arable land that is going back into permanent pasture, I think has certainly increased in the last 4 or 5 years. I think the other thing is that farming practices are changing. You don't see ploughed fields left over winter now. They've generally got cover crop on. 35 years ago when I came to Herefordshire, growing potatoes, the wisdom was you plough it in the autumn and you leave it to get the frost tilth over winter. Well, that was putting a lot of soil into the river. That really doesn't happen now. People don't plough in the autumn and leave it. They put a cover crop on, or they just leave it as a stubble and let it regenerate on its own to try and hold those nutrients into the soil. So things really have changed. They need to change further. And I'm certainly not disputing that, and I'm trying to encourage farmers to make those changes.
Okay, right. Well, I'll let you jump the queue then if you want.
My questions have been answered. Thanks.
Your question's been answered. So, Councillor Thomas, if you don't mind, I'll let Councillor Proctor come in first.
So I think this is where you want to take things. So what I was thinking in listening to that discussion was there's this big systemic stuff that will require Parliament and government to do big things, and so what is left for us to do, and some of that might involve kind of joining up some of the powers that we have, some of the other goals that we want to achieve. So, for example, we're keen on mitigating flooding, we're keen on mitigating carbon, so planting a lot of trees is probably going to be part of that solution, and planting a lot of trees might be part of the solution to reducing phosphate input. And we have a role around trying to broker and a more sustainable economy. So is it reasonable to think of, just to follow the trees through, Herefordshire Council playing a role in trying to stimulate and create a kind of local sustainable woodland cycle that would give a market for people to plant trees on their land and would have all these other benefits? Or is that, are those sorts of interventions again just going to be in this kind of kilograms rather than tons?
Councillor Swinton,
no, I'm happy to talk about that. Well, I'm not sure whether it's if I can get it down to a recommendation type, this is what we would do. But is this part of our wider work to support that kind of activity, as well as looking at doing it directly where we can? And I suppose it's always the frustration with the councillors. You want to do more than perhaps falls reasonably within our purview, but we have to accept that there's what we can do directly, there's what we can inspire in others, and I think we're kind of trying to max out on that as much as we can, because you're quite right that these are the sorts of actions that are no regrets. but a lot of them will also then come about through things like landscape recovery schemes, which we are working with partners to support. And so we're part of a much wider group of people trying to bring about these changes in the landscape scale activity and delivery of different, and I mean that would be things like river buffers and margins and planted margins and trees and hedgerows and a lot more wider work. And also, and Andrew in CPR doing fantastic work on hedgerows. So there's a brilliant sort of network of organisations, the NGOs, which we work with and support to deliver good stuff. But we're always looking to do more. So happy to always have conversations if you have an idea about where we can do that.
Before I bring you in, Liz, and Councillor Thomas, thanks for your patience, because I know you've been waiting. We were going to talk about, Councillor Swinglehurst, the Y, the special plan for the Y catchment area. I'd like you to update us on that, because I've got a lot of sympathy with what Councillor Proctor is saying, because just looking at the land use and land management problem and trying to do something specific and targeted in terms of phosphorus and maybe nitrogen as well and other nutrients, it seems to miss the point that when it comes to planning, having a joined up approach to the whole way that we look at the landscape across Herefordshire, which is what Yscape's trying to do as well, seems to me a much more productive way of looking at what we should be taking forward here, rather than specific individual plans. And I just wondered whether you want to update us on your chat with the Minister and what might be happening in that sort of area.
Yeah, because there can be an enormous number of plans, and it's all a bit confusing, as you're saying with the diagram, what I call the fried egg diagram. So the plan for the Y, the DEFRA plan for the Y that came out towards the end of the previous government, didn't really do enough kind of quality consultation with the people here on the ground doing this stuff. So as a result, it didn't really meet the needs that we had. So we were engaging with DEFRA to try to get that to pivot to more useful actions, and particularly around the 35 million, which in that plan was to support the development of technology to deal with the excess poultry litter, which frankly is something that the sector can do perfectly well without public money. Be much better if that money was put into good actions on the ground. So, but of course that conversation then stopped because of the change of government, and it didn't really have the opportunity to restart because everyone has to get themselves organised when they come into office. But we did have a meeting, and I have to say, first time it was a meeting with cross-border presence, and I have to say that was most welcome. So we had the Deputy First Minister, Huranka Davis, in the meeting. We had a Monmouthshire MP who had actually sort of been kind of one of the main drivers to get that meeting, Kath Folkes, who'd done a fabulous job. Our own Ellie Chowns was there, and Minister Emma Hardy. So it was very, very good to get that collaborative cross-border conversation finally happening at ministerial level. It was a short meeting. The simple ask was the plan that we all recognise as being the plan, both referenced within the DEFRA plan for the Y, which sort of ironically said what we need is a plan. It was a plan requiring a plan. That we already have a proposal, which is the catchment partnership, the holistic, looking at everything, looking at all the things that impact the catchment and the health of the river, not just nutrient, but everything. That's the plan that we would all like to see, with proper actions and measures and ways of delivering the improvements that we need to see. We've worked, I think, very hard, particularly Liz Dooby's worked very hard on getting the scope for that plan to get it to the stage where it can go out for tender, but it needs to have some funding just to get that across the line. So that was our major ask. If we can get that across the line, along with a promise that the actions that plan then identifies, rather than just saying we need this action and this action and this action, the logical, sensible way of approaching this is you look at the evidence, you look at the data. Evidence, data, plan, action, outcome, not a bunch of actions. some data over here, you know, which is all very unjoined up, and the funding's sort of somewhere else. This is trying to get everything all in one place. So it's really, really critical. And working with the nutrient management plan as a kind of, as I say, the yolk in the egg, the specific focus on the nutrient issue in that plan. And that's how we can sort of get, hopefully, you know, evidence, data, actions, outcomes, all working together with the essential bit, which is the funding to deliver that. Has to all happen in the same place and not be spread about too much. So that's sort of where the plans are at the moment. And that may then finally just be, everything just comes together into that single vision.
I'll bring you in a minute, Councillor Thomas, but I just want to tease this out in case there's a recommendation here. I mean, I'm very attracted to this idea of the wider landscape plan. Does that mean that the Nutrients Management Board needs to change its focus? Because it seems to me that it's looking very much at a Pacific issue and trying to tackle the overload of nutrients in the river. But as Farm Herefordshire have already said, that could take 40 or 50 years. So that doesn't seem like a plan that would actually happen. But the landscape plan seems to me perhaps
they've got to be seamlessly together, you know. So the you know, as it happens at the moment, it's the nutrient management plan is the one that's got funding is actually going to happen. The catchment partnership plan is a great idea and it's scoped and ready to go, but it hasn't got any funding. And also the other thing to remember about the nutrient management plan, specifically the nutrient management board, is the only meeting that is a public meeting about all of this. So it's important to always keep that element. Steve's right about, you know, what we're focusing about how long it will take to take the phosphate out of the soils. But the critical middly bit is how the phosphate is getting from the soil into the river. It's the pathways, and so you could reduce that. You can reduce the losses, and you can crop it out. You can accelerate this over time, and you can decelerate the losses because, you know, that's very clear that pollution pathways travelling with the soil into the river. That's a problem. So, you know, there are lots of things that we could do that would make this better. You know, in the medium term, shall we say? There are short-term actions, there are medium-term actions. Long-term, yes, it will take a very long time, but there are other things that can be done in the meantime, all of which need to be identified within these plans, both the catchment partnership plan, which may be looking at, say, flow. That would be the sort of thing the catchment partnership plan would look at. So, you know, actions in the top of the catchment to slow water into the rivers, because that's causing all sorts of issues. But on the other hand, the pathways from an arable field in the lower river taking nutrient into it may be something that the nutrient management plan would look at. But they work together. You know, the plans have to fit seamlessly together, and that's, I think, what we've been trying to achieve. And Herefordshire Council has taken a lead in this, given we're not the only authority that's impacted by the issue, but we do take the lead in almost every area.
I'll bring Mary in because she won't come in then. I know, Councillor Thomas, I've got to give you your opportunity.
Liz and Ben might know more about the technicalities, but as far as I'm aware, a DWPP, given that it's a High Court judgment, is a legal entity of its own right, that you have to have an action plan that demonstrates that ecological conditions the identified issue can be resolved. So there's not kind of, at the Nutrient Management Board, we have a few ideas that never seem to get anywhere, or we write them down, but then nobody wants to do them. It's a much different kind of type of plan, but also, as far as I'm aware, you also can't use resource as a reason for not doing it. But if we were to then go back to the government to say, okay, here's our DWPP that's been produced in March, however, the actions are so vast, without funding, we cannot deliver them. I believe the government are supposed to then fund the actions. I think that's how it kind of works. But bearing in mind that we're also in this devolution pickle, they should be obligated to providing Herefordshire with a bespoke solution, because we are not covered under their Water Act. So if I, again, was able to put a recommendation, it would be that we approach the government or DEFRA or the Ministry of Housing, whatever, to say, once the DWPP is in place, how are they going to fund the actions? You know, put it back on their doorstep. Otherwise, these actions will sit there and they will be scary and they'll be unpalatable and they'll be terrifying, and they are systemic change if what we've been told is what they're going to say. But there's no way that Herefordshire Council can afford that. There's no way that housing should or can provide it. And there's also the argument that farming won't be able to and probably won't want to either, which that's going to be, I think, the kind of baseline. who's going to do it? The government can't leave us with a plan that says, here are your action points, you can't do them. That's, illegal as far as I'm aware under the DWPP process.
So what you're saying is that the DWPP itself is not a solution unless the government does something else to actually enable it to happen.
Yeah, the actions in the DWPP are legally binding, so I don't know what we do about that. So the nutrient management plan is a little bit of a more voluntary exercise, and the DWPP have already red flagged to us that the existing legislation, voluntary measures, and the things that the farmers are already doing through kind of, I suppose, organic processing aren't enough. So they are going to give us big things, aren't they?
And my understanding of that is that it came about, the challenge, the legal challenge was that there had not been due consideration of a water protection zone. So the DWPP is that due consideration. So in other words, say, here are all the things that we can do, and if that doesn't work, water protection zone.
So Chair, my point, I forgot, I didn't really articulate it, was that the government owe Herefordshire, I believe the government owe Herefordshire money, a pot of money. Yeah.
They have to fund it.
Yes, because otherwise...
Implementation DWPP.
Yeah, we're in this kind of quirk of devolution.
Because it won't come from the water bill funding.
Yeah.
There has to be a Pacific Water. Councillor Thomas, I hope you'll forgive me.
I was actually going to say I'm defending council officers, especially because I sit on the planning committee. It's not the officers that are causing a problem, it is EA and English Heritage. They're the ones that hold everything up. I have a big scheme in my ward, which is going to be 70 odd houses. It's been going now 5 years, purely from outside bodies, nothing to do with planning, purely outside bodies. Welsh Water mainly and EA are holding it all up because they cannot decide on where the storage is going to go. Simple as that. But as regards farming, we have to make this decision. Food security, it's a lot of it's about talking about it at the moment. If our farmers don't grow it, where are we going to grow it in the world? The population of the world is increasing at an alarming rate. There aren't any other cheap sources abroad that we can bring it in from that have our sort of standards. So, you know, you're facing a great problem. And talking about figures for thing, we had a talk from David Williams, I think, the chairman of the NFU? Mark, sorry, who had figures from the Lug and the Froome from back in the 60s and 70s, vastly higher than what it is now. But no, they can't be shared because they weren't taken in a public forum.
Councillor Swinglehurst and then Liz.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. I've got a paragraph here, and this is a very current document, looking at the orthophosphate source apportionment in the Lug. And it goes something to what you were saying. So there's been a 21.4% decrease in the orthophosphate point source concentration of the current model, PR24 calibration model, 0.022 milligrams per litre, compared to the 2009 baseline. So that's a decrease in the point source. That's the investment of Welsh Water showing there. Meanwhile, the diffuse sector concentration has increased to 225%. So there would have been a point where you see decrease because of the millions of pounds invested by Welsh Water. However, that's been somewhat wiped out by the diffuse water share. So that's the full picture. You can look at a little one side of it and say, look, it's going, but no, you have to look at the whole picture really. I think that's important. Yeah.
Liz, and then I'll bring in Steve and Liz first.
Yes, I was just going to mention that refocusing their kind of recent interim sort of presentation that's giving a kind of picture now around phosphate is that it is showing that they've said that the 1970s is probably the worst period, and actually levels are starting to fall. But I think the issue as we see it, is that there is roughly 50% legacy phosphorus leaching in and 50% current application. So we need to tackle that current application, well, the two alongside each other. And the DWPP will be proposing, from what I can see, a set of around kind of 5 main priority actions that have come from the evidence that they've undertaken and the modelling. And we're also progressing with Welsh Government funding the kind of Welsh evidence, and the intention is to align those two pieces of evidence so that you have a catchment-wide picture on nutrients and a plan that is prioritised actions to take forward, and then that will sit within the wider Y catchment plan, which will look at the river more holistically and consider how those wider issues can cause peaks and troughs within the nutrients as well.
Stephen?
Yeah, just slightly going back on the EA had a consultation with folk about the DWPP going back, this was last autumn, and looking at where the phosphorus in particular comes from in the Y catchment, which comes really back to today, talking about where the focus I thought was on the lug, but the Y is okay most of the time. It's not failing. It's under the levels permitted, but the lug is consistently failing. And so my hope is that that plan will focus on the lug and how the improvements can be made there. When you get the lug gets to the confluence with the Y suddenly spikes because there's all that phosphorus going down the lug. Above that, yeah, there are occasionally blips. The other thing I think to mention is I was out to dinner with somebody the other night, and we were walking back from the pub, and they said, oh, of course, the Wye is the dirtiest river in the country. Well, it's absolutely not. It has lower set permitted levels than a lot of other rivers because it's an SSSI, it's an SAC. So we're working in Herefordshire with lower levels than most rivers in the rest of the country. And, you know, we're going to get breaches occasionally partly because of that, partly because there is too much going in. But, you know, we have to recognise, I think, that we are working at tighter restrictions than a lot of other catchments.
I'm going to touch upon that point when we go on to the fourth objective, which is looking at the economic, social and environmental impacts of this, because I still haven't got my head around why the Lug and its tributaries have this particular issue with overload, where, as you say, Stephen, the Wye generally hasn't, but maybe we can just touch upon that later on. Councillor Swinghurst?
Part of the answer to that is volume of water. There's a lot more water in the Wye. What I was going to say is that one of the things that we've done recently, and again, it's sort of one of those things the council can do, convening and giving space to things and platforming stuff. As we had a farming conference looking at particularly problematic crops like potatoes, as Steve was saying, and it was an opportunity to hear from farmers how they are bringing about improved practice, what they're doing to farm differently. And to farm sustainably, and that was really quite encouraging. So I don't want everyone to get the impression that it's all totally disastrous. It's not. We have got some of the best farmers in the country here. If not, we have internationally great farmers. Farmers who lecture all around the world to help all agricultural systems look at this problem. We're not unique. So we have got some that are absolutely leading the charge, but we also have to deal with the generality and everything, and make sure that good practice gets out everywhere and support farmers to transition, because that's scary. That's really difficult. And that's something that the government should be doing, I think, is sort of saying, look, we're asking you to go, a lot of the intensification of farming is because of previous governments saying you need to intensify farming. So they're like, okay, we'll intensify away. And now we're saying, could you do that differently? So this transitionary period is very awkward for everybody, and I think we need to be understanding and supportive of that.
And when you talk about volume, it's because the lug is narrower and not as deep.
So there's a dilution principle. So that's just only part of the reason. It's also
And
different
Natural
to-
England doesn't take that into account?
Well, they would, yeah, because
Well, should it
that's-
not have higher overloads?
It's also
then?
the targets are different, and the interesting, the really curious thing, and this is one of those cross-border issues. The targets are different for the Y in Wales. So in Wales, the Y is as it were failing for water quality as an SAC. So it fails up to the point where it comes into Herefordshire, and it fails at the point it leaves Herefordshire. The Herefordshire bit is okay, but I see you can get very misled just looking at targets, because actually you need to look at the biological health of an ecosystem.
Mary, you wanted to come in.
So I live in the Arrow, so I kind of feel like I sort of know that and why it might be different. So one of them is that it's a smaller river, so it's got less dilution of the phosphorus going in, which the Y, as Stephen said, has a huge volume, so it kind of dilutes itself a bit. We do have a concentration of animal types, so we do have a lot of poultry units, but we also have a lot of dairy units. And it's not because anybody did anything wrong, they just somehow have collected themselves within quite a small area. But then Refocus were very clear that they felt that our soils were already at saturation point, so people hadn't realised that the amount of phosphorus or total phosphorus in the soil was already incredibly high, and it reaches a tipping point by which it can no longer buffer the phosphorus and hold on to it itself. But also our soil type wants to leach this, and by having more movement of soil, I think 50% of the topical phosphorus application gets lost through soil loss. So they gave us a picture of it. I found it quite useful. Alyssa used to say it was a bath, but they chose a bucket. And this bucket had holes in the bottom all the way at the top. And it said that you already had a lot of phosphorus, but then your tap was turning and it's still turning. So you can keep plugging the gaps, putting a plaster over the hole. They'll blow off at some point, but unless you either fix the bucket properly or preferably replace the bucket, that won't make any difference. But the primary thing they wanted us to realise is you have to turn the tap off, because you can't really replace the bucket or fix it while the tap was running. And I think the lug is a really good example of lots of things happening in probably the catchment that wasn't designed for those things to happen within. And you can't really turn the clock back. It's happened now, but we need to work out, do we keep going and saying we're happy with it being a failing catchment, or do we do something meaningful? And like I say, you've got world-class farmers. You've also got very good, our water company have actually done us a pretty good deal for the Y. They won't be able to keep putting that level of investment into the Y because they've got other rivers where they're not performing as well. So we need to be mindful that money stops. But obviously you've got world-class developers as well. So we've got all the good brains, but we just need to digest the fact the actions are probably bigger and need to do something, not nothing.
Just before I bring in Councillor Proctor, that brings us neatly on to Objective 3, which is about what other improvements can we bring to this particular problem. We've talked about wetlands, we've talked about private mitigation schemes, and I'll be interested to know if there's any ideas around the table over what else we could be doing, specifically for this sub-catchment area, and how the council could play a part in that, in case there's a recommendation we can actually pick from that discussion. Does Councillor Swinglehurst? I will bring in Councillor Proctor after this discussion.
I think this is the sort of thing that I would be very interested in what the committee's view of this is, because think about what do we have, what tools do we have in our toolbox as a local authority. Clearly, one of the tools we have is local planning authority. We have a core strategy coming through. We did put a policy W3, in the minerals and waste local plan, which was designed to address agricultural waste and asked that we should be dealt with appropriately both on and off site, but that's been the subject of a High Court challenge by the NFU, which we're still waiting to hear the outcome of. But ways in which we might use our toolbox, I think that's a really good question, and I'd be very interested in hearing what the committee has to say and what their view might be on that.
In terms of recommendation for this committee at this particular point in time, I suppose we could ask the executive to perhaps do a piece of work on that then. Would that be helpful? To look at what else apart from what... I mean, great credit to the council for the wetlands, leaving aside whether this solves some of the housing backlog. It's great for the ecology anyway to have wetlands. I mean, no one's going to say it isn't. But would there be I mean, it's not going to be a specific recommendation, but would that help you, Councillor Swinglehurst, to take that back to the executive for us to say, perhaps this is a time for us to do a piece of work here in terms of seeing what we can bring
Yeah,
to,
and it might
to
be
the
something, so we've
problem
got
here for this
LNRS.
sub-catchment area.
But it's exactly. I mean, something like the wetlands is great because the wetlands is meeting a very identified requirement need, but it also brings biodiversity. It improves the landscape. We'll be able to use it as an educational facility. You know, there are lots of other benefits that accrue alongside. So we're looking for sort of ways in which we might strategize that. Whether we're looking at, say, flooding reduction, that also can have an impact, and maybe we should look at that on a farm level as well to try to draw down nutrients.
The 3D buffers, I think.
Yeah, 3D buffers could be a thing planted. Yeah.
I will bring you in a minute, Councillor Proctor. I'm really interested in this issue around the volume and the size of the lug compared to anything else, and the fact that we seem to have a bigger challenge in terms of slowing down the leaching of the nutrients from the soil into that particular river. And it seems to me this is maybe an ideal time to perhaps stand back and do a piece of work to see what realistically we can do, or even engage with our partners to do, that targets this particular problem to do with this particular topography in terms of the lug.
I think a lot of that will come forward with the that should come forward with the DWPP, I would have thought, because they're trying to narrow down the focus as to where actions will have the most impact, and I think that's really important. And probably once that also aligns with the catchment plan, you'll get another sort of layering to that. So it may just be a matter that we watch and see what comes out of that, but look for opportunities for us as local authority to support and to make sure that those actions align with policies emerging in our own, say, our core strategy or the LNRS or other strategies that we're responsible for. It needs to all align.
Liz?
Yeah, really just to follow up on that, in that if the DWPP is due for sharing in spring 25, then it would be helpful to understand what they've identified as the priorities, and then we can consider how the council could take those forward through whatever mechanism is available.
Councillor Proctor? And then Councillor...
I want to pick up on the invitation for the committee to think of ways in which so one of the things that I started thinking about is how learning lessons from how the council approaches systemic issues in completely different areas. So, for example, children's safeguarding is a system, is all about the system, and the council plays a role at multiple levels. We have very specific roles with people that we employ who take on very specific tasks, but a lot of the reality of how the council operates in that system is by thinking about it as a system of many stakeholders, and thinking strategically about how it influences that system. And I think maybe there's an opportunity to kind of think about how where we do that well and where we don't do that well, and where there are opportunities to bring that in. And that got me thinking about back in the midst of time, I used to help public sector workers kind of think about innovation methodology, and that's that there are sort of frameworks for thinking, for bringing people into these systems and thinking through innovation, which tends to be, like real innovation tends to be, there's an interesting idea in a different sector, and actually we can bring it in here and tweak it a bit and then apply it in our sector. And so maybe within the local system there's, it's all going to be time and resource, but maybe there's a thinking about being explicitly like, how can we go through that innovation methodology and see what comes out. And then, because I'm specifically spend most of my day job sitting at a computer. There's the idea of hack days where you bring in geeks and give them a lot of data and a problem and then see what comes out the other end. And usually that won't produce a product, but what it might produce is a different way of framing the problem or a different direction to go in. So, yeah, those are.
Is there a recommendation there at all?
We could probably. I'll have a think about some language around
good.
that. Yeah.
Councillor Davis, then Councillor Febity.
Thank you, Chair.
You want to come in?
I'd like to ask the question of, do we think, with the current situation in the Lug Valley, Lug feeder area that goes into the Y, bearing in mind that the land is phosphate loaded at the moment. This is down to over 100 years of farming techniques that were not designed to pollute the rivers, but designed to increase productivity of the farms by the farmers in the first place. So there's no element of blame saying you've done this deliberately. It's because as we've grown in intelligence in how we do things, we suddenly realise the consequences of our actions later down the line, which is not easily resolved. Part of the Lug area is the geography of the valley itself, and where the Lug feeds in is, as the land is phosphate loaded, and now our climate conditions and the extreme weather of sudden downpours, when the ground becomes saturated, and then further downpours just cause all that phosphate to be washed into the waterways. If we had a prolonged period of dry spells, then that potentially would reduce the phosphate going into the Y significantly, although that's not liable to happen. So how can we mitigate against weather conditions? Is further wetlands or some other system feasible to try and mitigate the wet conditions that are causing the phosphate flooding? Just a thought.
I think my question kind of possibly taps into those two as well, which is about what the potential is for this this possible change in legislation to move towards sort of more strategic mitigation systems. Presumably that opens up the option of doing things on a larger scale, and whether there's potential for just the kind of collaborative elements that have been referred to here about thinking about flooding mitigation and nutrient management and all those things within a similar kind of large-scale natural system like we achieved with the wetlands, and whether that new legislation is going to provide potential or opportunity for that.
I want to bring Andrew in here because he's been waiting.
I just wanted to comment on a question that you asked, Chair. One of the aspects that hasn't been mentioned but is critical is load and flow. And that is, you can actually have a high load coming out of a small drain, but if it's going into a high flow river like the Y, it's not significant. But if it's going into a summer period with low flow in the Lug, it's amazingly significant. So I think that there is an aspect here that we need a lot more investigation to understand load and flow, because that's changing. Taking the point about climate change, that has a significant impact. So I do think that there's an element there. The second point I'd like to make is that we've talked about a lot of ideas and a lot of things. The one thing that I think is absolutely critical, and I suspect Councillor Proctor would support this, is measuring outcomes. Because we had a meeting in this room with the Nutrient Management Board where Natural England came forward with all the work they had done in terms of farm advice, etc., and we asked the questions and what was the outcome. And the answer was, we don't measure outcomes. So how can you put vast sums of money into any project if you're not going to measure the outcomes? So I'd just like to raise that I think that anything that this committee decides, there has to be a point where you understand outcomes of the real issue. How do we measure them? And go back and see, were we successful? If not, change what you're doing. Thank you.
There was a bit of a discussion going on Teams here, but I think we both recall there was a recommendation made by this committee about monitoring a monitoring station on the lug, and I can't quite recall the detail of it, but there.
I
do
can
you
tell you,
remember?
it came from a recommendation by Simon Evans from the YNUS Foundation that we should put some money into installing some sondes into the lug, and the committee positively supported that. But I think Councillor Swinglehurst, the executive, felt they couldn't fund it at this time. I think we did get a response.
We did follow it up with Simon, and I think we struggled to get the ball back again. I think it's just sort of. I suspect he funded it some other way. Because
we are going to have
we have got a number of sondes in the catchment, both WAF sondes and the Environment Agency. So the data is being captured. So my guess is that they found another way of funding it.
He did
Mary?
he did have one in the Edersland Arrow,
Yeah.
but it was only there for a very short time. But I presume WAF funded that, but they wanted to take it out before it went into flood season because apparently the floods wiped them away. So then obviously your data is only partial. But I think it would be useful to get a set of sonde data, because I think in the last EA report we had at the Nutrient Management Board, they said this rolling 3-year data analysis they do to whether you're meeting target, they didn't collect data for 2024 for some reason, or it hasn't been qualified to be usable. I'll have to check what the actual wording is, but I think we could probably put a bit more pressure into saying what is the current rolling 3-year data, because I'm conscious that there are farmers doing things, then if the improvement isn't kind of captured, it can be really demoralising to think you did something, and not only was it not recognised, but also then people go, well, you were paid to do that, so where's the outcome? And that doesn't seem fair to kind of fund it that way. Just back on the point about the Nature Recovery Fund, as a mechanism for mitigation, it might be useful. It might be kind of like a streamlined version of what we've already got with the wetland. But the amount of money that developers will be putting into that would be nowhere near the amount you require to have meaningful catchment recovery. So the Nature Recovery Fund might be useful for mitigation, even though I believe mitigation shouldn't be on, the onus should not be on house builders in the lug. But I think be wary of it being the answer to our catchment problems, unless the government are going to give us hundreds of millions of pounds into a lug-specific Nature Recovery Fund, which when I went to the round table consultation, they didn't mention that. So I don't want to kind of be the bearer of bad news, but the funding all came from development, and we're talking about such a small number of houses in Herefordshire. So morally, we shouldn't be paying, but also there'd be no way we could do anything meaningful. So the Nature Recovery Fund has got potential. I think Liz and I think it's got potential, but it just would, for Herefordshire, would need quite a lot of extra work behind it. And on the point about whether wetlands are an answer, just again to re-echo Andrew's point, the Luston wetland, as far as I know, does around about 230, 240 kilograms of mitigation, tradable mitigation. The TAP that they showed us on that bucket graphic is adding 2,300,000 kilograms every year. So the option of wetlands is not balanced with the impact of the problem. You could look at a bespoke water protection zone or something like that, where we really work very closely with what's going to deliver the outcomes to protect the river, catchment. So climate change, the rising of temperatures, but also the lack of shading on the river is probably something really meaningful that can already be paid for through government subsidies. So there are levers like that. The council probably have a few levers with regard to planning policies, and I would extend an invitation to the council from the lobby group to say that we would be very happy to work with them on specific lug planning policies that we think might have potential, even if they're only for a short amount of time, 5-10 years. We think there are things you could do, and it comes back to the point about, are the orchards going to last forever? I would say, I'm speaking on behalf of quite a lot of other people really, but if there was a policy that said that every rural application using a sewage treatment plant had to have an orchard downstream of the soakaway, I don't think developers are going to resist that, given that they're part of the people that have put it forward as an option already. So you could have policies that, we're out of moratorium, for example, but these policies are still embedded in written form to say best practice is, or we recommend that. I think that developers have never been a point of resistance for buying credits, putting in orchards, changing land use, all the things that you would like to see. The resistance hasn't come from the developers. Maybe national developers have got a different opinion, but I don't speak for them, sorry.
Councillor Swinglehurst, is that one for the local plan revision?
Yeah, I don't know whether, I don't know whether it would sit within the local plan. I'm very happy to raise it with the forward planning team, and to have that conversation.
If you're happy to take it forward, Councillor Swing, that's fine. But can we go back to Councillor Peverty's point about the wider legislation that's required here in terms of helping us to get to some sort of action plan to get the lug up to a healthy condition?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, completely agree with Mary. We would be deluding ourselves if we think enough resources are going to come forward as a result of this proposed change, and fair share and all the rest of it would seem to indicate that it wouldn't be appropriate, and it's unlikely to be of sufficient. But to go back to the point I was making earlier about where you've got a plan, whether it's the nutrient management plan or the catchment partnership plan, you have data and evidence, and they identify the appropriate actions, you take the actions, you get the outcomes, and somewhere in that you need the funding. And the problem that we have always had with the nutrient management plan and now with the catchment partnership plan is you have the data and the evidence, zip funding. At the moment, the catchment partnership hasn't got the funding to even keep its basic secretariat function alive, which is Herefordshire Council where we're looking to step up and help them out with that, because we recognise the critically important nature of that particular partnership board. But you know, they have that. You know, if they can write this plan, it will be a really great plan. The DWPP will be a good plan. You know, we'll identify what needs to happen. But unless the funding sits with the plan, there's going to be the same problem, which is you have a great plan and no funding to deliver it. And that's a fundamental issue, I think. We have funding that comes in from various places to do various good things, but that doesn't relate to the delivery of the plan, which is based on the data and the evidence and all the rest of it. So if we can only get sufficient money to deliver the plan, we'll be in a much better place.
Thank you. Councillor Highfield, did you want to raise a point earlier on, I think?
No, it's been covered by everybody else, and I'm pleased. I just comment that I'm pleased to see that everybody's of a like mind here. That there's not really any argument amongst us. What we want to do is to see how we can use our influence to help get things moving in the direction we all know it's got to go. All I just say is just because it's difficult doesn't mean we can't do it. We must do it.
Okay. We've got 10 minutes to go, then I'm going to call the debate to an end and have a break so that we can consider recommendations. Our last objective, and we have touched upon it, is understanding the economic, social and environmental implications of this issue around the overloading of the lug catchment area. Mary, do you want to add anything to that might inform this committee? Because we have covered some of it, but I just wondered whether there was anything specific that we might have missed on the economic side particularly.
So the economics are fairly startling, to be honest, and I think this was flagged quite early days in the moratorium, and Lichfield is kind of an independent statistician type company. They prepared a report and they chose the Y as one of their chosen areas, and the hemorrhaging of losses is quite incredible. It's been very difficult for me to get that kind of information recognised, but also the impact of that loss to be registered. So Lichfield basically estimated about £150 million losses every year, but they kind of calculated specific losses for the council, which would be council tax, new homes bonus, Section 106 agreements, and I think they came to around about £60 million direct losses to Herefordshire Council every year. And I watched the Cabinet Finance Committee meeting last week, and nobody even mentioned the moratorium, but you've got half of your county paralysed. Now, that might serve people that aren't particularly keen on housing, and I understand that there is an element of that nobody really likes new housing, but it's a huge amount of money. But that then also plays into the rural economy. So you've got jobs that haven't been created, jobs that have been lost, companies that have completely evaporated and vanished because of the moratorium. This is stuff that's already happened because we're into the 6th year of a moratorium. But 8 of the last 10 years have been under moratorium in the lug. So we've had a 2.5-year moratorium previously. So the financial losses, I know, don't always touch on people's sympathies. but as a kind of a corporate perspective, they are quite alarming, and they're also almost impossible to recover from. So people say, well, just wait for your credits. But I, for example, have had 5 years of no work in the area where I am based. I can't catch up on 5 years of work by doing it all in the next year. It's gone. And that is particularly difficult for SMEs to manage. But you've also lost a lot of affordable housing, not lost, it's kind of been affordable housing that hasn't been delivered. And I spoke to one of the guys who has purchased credits. They're doing a 53-unit affordable housing, completely paid for by Homes England in Leominster. They waited 5 years for credits. They didn't mind buying the credits because it was a funded scheme by other people. But he pointed out that the rising cost between when they were going to build and when they are building is over £1 million. So that's around about 10 affordable housing that they won't be providing because their government money doesn't stretch depending on when you built. It's a grant-based system. But you've got lots of examples. So schools, for example, say there's children that would have been living in a village, that school were relying on those children going to school. Every child's occupation of a seat is money from the government, and if those schools can't capture that money, they can't provide the services that they thought they might be able to. So it does play out to every economic metric within our rural area, and I find it really a little bit embarrassing that we've all been not able to use that as some sort of lever to get people to help us. So the other local authorities have taken a different view in the sense that they've been very kind of finance-led on what the loss of housing will do to their counties. And that's because they've got bigger amounts of housing, and probably it is a bigger factor. I noticed that the planning department have reduced their, Melissa will know the detail, but I think it was like £1 million. They've projected £1 million less revenue as their kind of baseline now. Now, that is partly because of the moratorium. So it nibbles away at almost everything. But also some of these houses would have delivered really good things, whether that be affordable housing or orchards or whatever it might be. By not having them, we're kind of doing ourselves a disservice. Our housing growth, I think our population growth is less than 2%, which the West Midlands average is between 6 and 9%. The only place I can find that's a bit lower is our colleagues in Powys. They're at a tiny percent, probably 20 people a year they add. So again, we're looking at kind of doing ourselves another injury by not having a tax base that we can provide the services that you as council members identify, social care, children's services. They all require funding. And unfortunately, the way that that is funded is through people living here and working here and paying taxes here. And I think we have to just be really realistic about the harm that's been done and maybe a recovery position. But my main ask on the finances is that next time this crops up, because I'm sure there'll be something, whether it's nitrogen or ammonia or something else, that we do a risk assessment of all the contributing issues that are going to swill around a kind of a decision on October the 15th, 2019, no more new build planning approvals. We should have looked at ecology, economy and sustainability together, because they are linked, but we've done ourselves more harm than we did protect ourselves, in the construction group's opinion.
Thanks, Mary. Before I bring you in, Ben, and I'm conscious that Councillor Heathfield and Councillor Proctor want to raise some points. Councillor Swingerhurst, in the council plan, I'm going to read it out because I think this is very important. Under place, we will protect and enhance our environment and ensure that Herefordshire remains a great place to live. We will support the right house in the right place and do everything we can to improve the health of our rivers. That's place. Growth. We will create the conditions to deliver sustainable growth across the county. We want to attract inward investment, create more jobs, enable housing development and provide the right infrastructure to keep Herefordshire moving forward. It just seems to me with a housing target that's up 60%, with those two laudable aims in the council plan, that surely we as a council need to start thinking, how do we unlock this potential in this 40% of the county that is just not happening at the moment? And I just don't know how that happens unless we do it through the local plan. I'll let you come in, Councillor Swingerhurst, if you want to make a comment. Then I'll bring in Ben, then I'm going to Councillor Heathfield, and then Councillor Proctor, then I'm bringing the debate to an end because we have to look at recommendations. Councillor Swingerhurst.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I mean that sort of cuts to the number of the issue. We didn't create the moratorium. The decision that was taken at the time was to, having looked at options, to was to come forward with mitigation. And I have to say, I think our mitigation is incredibly honest. You know, it really is. It's a very high standard. It's very honest. It's won awards. It's very excellent. So we can continue to do that. But it's not the same thing as just getting over them, or just saying forget the moratorium. But it's conversations have been had with government. I've argued threshold of significance. We've done, I think, everything that we could do to try and change the circumstance that we're operating in. But we are where we are. The trick that we've got at the moment is not investing ahead of what the government might do, and you never know quite what the government might do. So they're proposing things through MHCLG, which we've got a meeting this afternoon to discuss. Which, if we then say, well, we'll invest, another £3 million, anticipating the requirement for that mitigation, and then the government changes tack and comes up with a different solution, then that would prove to be an unwise decision. So we have to move just ahead of what we need to do, really. And this has been the problem for a long time, because the government has been nosing around this government, the previous government, and you're always trying to second guess what they might be going to do next, so that you don't then over invest in a solution which becomes unnecessary. It's very difficult to make that judgment. I think we're doing well with it. I think we've got enough mitigation coming through now to meet the demand. You're right about the latent demand. You're right about that, and obviously the demand that will then come on top as the new housing numbers start to feed into the system. But we have to deal with that within the local plan first. So that the change may have occurred at MHCLG by the time we get to that. So it's kind of juggling all these different things that are running on different tracks and trying to get everything to arrive at the finish line at the same time is quite difficult. But we are very mindful of it, and we're very mindful of the unfairness of what's happened to the house building, home building industry. It's absolutely awful, to say nothing of the impact on the council in terms of our own income, but also the local economy. The hit on the local economy it's appalling.
Ben, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, Councillor Swinghurst has said most of what I was going to say, but I suppose just reflecting on the conversation today, the council's got opportunities through its power of regulation, direct action through intervention, and convening and leadership, and hopefully this discussion has sort of shown that we are very committed to all aspects of that through the conference, through looking at what we can do with private mitigation, advisory service. As Councillor Swinghurst said, the mitigation schemes we've done have won awards, and we've been pioneering that globally. We do want to go faster. We are looking for more, so we'd very much welcome ideas of what we can do there. But I think a lot of this is very much partnership, and I think that's where the power of those ministerial meetings and working with others for those solutions has been key. So I suppose it's a really difficult issue, and I think we've sort of really challenged that today. But I just wanted to reflect that there is a tremendous amount of work going here, and that will to listen for those ideas to take more action where we can.
Councillor Heathfield, then Councillor Proctor, and then we're going to then consider our recommendations.
Thank you for that very sobering, very brief summary of the Lichfield study and work. It's made me think of other sources of impact and information, and also other sources of money to just flip and do something. So the first thing is, we haven't mentioned at all the Lee Day case against the Environment Agency, and they are collecting evidence from all kinds of people across Herefordshire have been impacted, and I wonder if that will be useful to us at all once it's made public. Number two, it makes me think very much of Avara and how much profit they have made from what they've been doing in Herefordshire, and how they're currently now off doing the same in Northamptonshire and Lincolnshire and many other places. And I wonder how much phosphate is in the soils there. I'm very aware of the Oklahoma ruling about the Illinois River and how Cargill were tasked with cleaning up the soil there, removing the phosphate, and that was back in 2023, and I can't find any information about what's actually happened there. So wouldn't it be nice if there was some money available there? And finally, I'm really sorry, Mary, I'm going to ask a really irritating question, and it's probably really stupid. So yeah, obviously that Lichfield study shows, the moratorium needs to be removed. I just want to double check, if it was removed, would that undermine continuing work on the wetlands and the credit scheme? Would it mean that we wouldn't be able to ask for that private mitigation? And also, reading between the lines of what you were saying, it sounds like possibly national legislation is coming that would allow the continuing of the wetlands. So we don't need to, we won't be, at some point soon, we won't be relying on the moratorium, and we'll be able to rely on that national legislation instead. I just wanted, sorry to be so technical and irritating.
I've got a perspective on it, but it would be up to Ben and Liz and Alyssa to say whether it's right or not. So I understand the level of risk you'd be at committing to significant mitigation if I'm yapping away saying, I don't think it's fair, we're under moratorium at all. However, your wetlands can be layered for other types of fiscal contribution, whether that be BNG or carbon, or there are other markets that the wetlands, I think, have been probably designed to kind of capture if it ever came true. But mitigation was only ever supposed to be temporary. It wasn't supposed to be a forever situation. What we should all be looking at is how do we restore the catchment so we're not in mitigation. So the fact we need mitigation is a failure. So I understand the work that's gone in, and I've been to the wetlands, and like I said, I pushed for them. The lobby group got very close to paying for a private one ourselves to try and prove the concept of it. But it shouldn't be something that you kind of burden me with forever, because it isn't something that I think is a good reflection of where we're going to get to, hopefully in catchment terms. My last point on that is I believe I have a very slim overview of the finances, but on my kind of quick calculations, there is a lot of money that's gone in from either purchasing the credits, LEP grant for £1 million, the government gave 1.7 million, and there was £2 million of new homes bonus allocated. There is a lot of money that is there for wetlands that could still happen whether I'm in moratorium or not. So I don't think you have to rely on us to fund good works going forward, but I would caution the moral argument of expecting that to be the case, because it means we haven't fixed the catchment.
Just before I bring in Councillor Proctor, and I had looked at the Oklahoma case as well, we got the extended producer grant, which is a levy on retailers who been really charged for the plastic that they produce, because we as a council have to then collect and dispose of that plastic. Is there any mileage in asking them, the government to do something similar for those producing chicken manure, pig manure, cow manure? A sort of levy that we could then use in order to reinvest in cleaning up the liver? And then I'll bring Councillor Proctor in to finish off the debate.
I think, for a start, we have to recognise that the poultry grower is not Avara. Avara is the processor. So when you're talking about the grower, you're talking about the suppliers to Avara. Should they have to pay a levy because they have litter? Well, they would argue that their litter is not waste, it is litter, and if it's used correctly, it could actually interestingly be used in any number of ways that would be could be beneficial, to generate energy and so forth. Really, it's about pollution, I think, for me. So we should have good, clear regulations about what you do. Anything that is surplus to requirements is a waste, I think, and if it is not disposed of correctly, it can cause damage to the environment, and that needs to be considered. I'm not sure that you could just put an equivalent to the EPR on arisings from poultry, and if it was poultry, it would have to also be pigs and cows and sheep and everything else. And I don't really see how that would work. I don't know.
And that brings me back to my favourite subject of a water protection zone, which we as a council adopted in January 2022, and which would obviously regulate the sort of activities that we're trying to reduce here. Stephen, and then I'll bring in Councillor Proctor.
Yeah, sorry, it just, this is sort of like the polluter pays, it seems to me, and I have a slightly different take on who the polluter is. So if I drive a diesel car, I'm a polluter. It's not to me, it's not the guy digging it out the ground, it's me. If I eat chicken from Avara, I'm contributing to their footprint, if you like, their pollution footprint. So I think it's more about personal responsibility. And, you know, we've had a cheap food policy in this country since 1947 Agriculture Act. And it's down to everybody. And it's about changing everybody's mindset to drive an electric or a hybrid car, to eat food that is produced responsibly. But not everybody can afford to do that. And that's the rub for me.
Final words from Councillor Proctor.
I think I have broadly three things. So just picking up on the chicken litter issue. So knowing nothing about the subject at all, it feels like this is a surplus product that could be used to generate energy, and it comes out of a system that requires a reasonable amount of energy. And so understanding why that's not happening and what can be done to incentivize that, I think feels like something that could happen in the system. I was really struck by what Mary said about the consequences on the economy and on people's lives, and I guess my particular concern is really about social housing in particular and the constraint there. But really, this is a tax on development, and we shouldn't be taxing development. And so, thinking about how quickly we can move to a situation which isn't necessarily removing the moratorium, but is meaning that we're not taxing developers in order to provide this mitigation, that feels like something we should be looking for. And as I chaired the committee where this didn't come up as a finance issue, I will take that on board and make sure it comes up next time. And then I guess what I've been struck with as someone not sort of deeply in this debate and is I'm not sure we have a clear, succinct narrative about the sorts of things that Mary was talking about and the issue about the imbalance between housing and distributed pollution, all that sort of thing. And I think in terms of, and this maybe comes back to some of the stuff we're talking about, right, in terms of kind of helping members to understand, helping other stakeholders people who are not kind of working on this day to day, I feel like there is what's emerged for me here is there is a clear story, but I think we could be better at articulating it. If we all start articulating the same story, then maybe one day government will actually hear what we're saying.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Proctor. Thank you, everyone, for a really interesting debate. I'm not sure whether we're near an answer yet, and obviously I want the committee to consider what recommendations we might make, at least to move things forward. But I'm very grateful for everyone attending today. I'm going to call a break for 20 minutes. If the committee and anyone else who wants to come back can come back at past. Can we have the live stream pause? Right.
Chair, the live stream is
Yeah. I'd just like to welcome back everyone who's looking in on YouTube. That was a very interesting but very challenging debate on what is a very, very difficult problem for us in terms of the River Lug. We have come up with a number of recommendations, I think 9. Do you want to talk us through it, Scrutiny Officer?
Thank you very much, Chair. At the moment, I have 8 recommendations drafted for you. You'll see the first 5 on the screen here. Unfortunately, they are so many and so numerous that, or so verbose that I can't get them all onto one, unfortunately. So I'll flip between the 2 slides, if I may. So these are those on your first, and you have these 3 here as well. I won't read these out at the moment. I'll read them out once we've agreed them, or once we've come to a form of words that we can agree upon.
Do you want to read them out one by one? Or not?
As I said, I'll read these out once we get to the point that we should agree them. So is there any discussion around these before we get to that stage?
Yes, Councillor Highfield.
Yes, from what I've learnt on this in this meeting, I think we already reached the point where there's enough evidence to end the moratorium. We don't need a pathway towards more. We've got enough evidence, and I think that first recommendation should be that the moratorium be ended immediately.
The problem is we are not masters of our own destiny here.
No, we're only recommending.
We do need to have an exit pathway, because we have to take Natural England with us, because at the end of the day it will be Natural England's advice to the government that will cause the moratorium to be lifted. So I don't think we can have a unilateral recommendation simply saying we urge the Natural England to lift the moratorium. I think we have to engage with them.
Why can't we ask Natural England why the moratorium cannot be removed immediately? What is their evidence for not doing so?
Comments?
I think Councillor Highfield is right, but we're probably, we need to push the executive now to get this moratorium lifted. So they need to do, as I said earlier on, we need to do a lot of work now. And Elisa's right, the evidence is there. However many houses we build, we are not going to make the problem in the lug. So therefore, I think Robert is right, but it isn't that we must immediately declare UDI. What he means is we must get the executive to work totally on this, on getting rid of it.
Before I bring Councillor Proctor in, that first recommendation, an exit pathway can be a very quick exit pathway. It doesn't have to be years. I'm just trying to find what would you like to change in terms of the form of words there in order to achieve what you want to achieve?
Well, before the meeting, I saw your proposed wording for this, and I fully agree with it. I thought that sounded very sensible. But what I've heard at this meeting suggests to me that the exit pathway needn't be, well, we've got to achieve this and achieve that, and then we can knock it off. We don't have to achieve anything else except persuade the other government agencies that there's no purpose anymore in the moratorium. We've done enough already. It doesn't meet any purpose towards clearing up the pollution. Indeed, as I said in a little message I've sent out, the fact that lots of extra money would appear if the moratorium ended because of Section 106 money, the increased biodiversity money, the increased council tax money, it would be positive for the rivers because there would be money that would go to things that would be helpful for the rivers. So it's not going to solve the river problem, but it's certainly not going to make them worse, and it might make them slightly different. So I can't see any grounds for keeping on the moratorium. We should ask them whether there are any grounds, what their grounds are for continuing it, given all the changes that have been done.
Councillor Proctor, then I'm going to bring in Councillor Pebbody, then Councillor Heathfield.
I guess from my point of view, we heard that the moratorium has a set of very negative consequences. I didn't hear anything that was evidence that we should just decide that we're going to suspend the moratorium. that recommendation seems to be exactly what we should be doing, which is engaging with government agencies as to end the moratorium as quickly as possible. But I didn't hear enough evidence to say we should.
Yeah. Before I bring that to you, and to go towards what you're saying, Councillor Highfield, I'm quite willing to take out the words to be drawn up. So to press for an exit pathway for achieving the lifting of the housing development moratorium. I mean, that is quite immediate. I mean, that really is pushing the executive. They will have to engage with Natural England. There's no way that we can just simply expect that to be lifted. Natural England will be the ones that will take the decision at the end of the day, not us.
Shouldn't we challenge Natural England to tell us why what reasons there are to continue the moratorium?
But surely, if we say, engage with Natural England and the Environment Agency to press for an exit pathway for achieving the lifting of the house and development moratorium as soon as possible?
Sure.
As soon as possible? Yeah. Yes, add as soon as possible. Councillor Pepperty, then Councillor Heathfield.
I don't want to get into semantics, but I would say that the exit pathway that we're on is the mitigation that we're putting in place. I mean, the moratorium was put on us, and our exit pathway is all the mitigation systems that we've put in place. So in some ways we have that. So I think we're at the point now where we're asking, where we've done that pathway, and from the evidence that Mary provided is that those results have been achieved.
No, the mitigation pathway doesn't get us out of the moratorium. It's just mitigating the impact of housing, so that
it doesn't.
To build.
Lift
The moratorium remains. It is a consequence of the moratorium, if you like.
Right.
One thing that I'm kind of interested in, and I'll talk to Mary about this afterwards, is whether or not, if the government are looking at strategic mitigation, they would then consider AMP 7 and 8 as sufficient strategic mitigation to say that fair share has been met and therefore the moratorium is no longer appropriate. So that needs to be kind of bottomed out, but that's a conversation with MHCLG, really, I think, probably.
And that's exactly what the first recommendation is trying to achieve. Councillor Heathfield?
Yeah, I just wanted to double check my question about whether ending the moratorium would undermine the wetlands and the credits and being able to ask for private mitigation. Do we need to wait for that sort of national legislation maybe to be in place to not endanger the progress that's been made, or actually are those wetlands happening anyway and it's fine? We heard from Mary, but I just wanted especially just to hear an officer view on the risks around the end of a moratorium, if there are any.
I was going to say, as officers, we would obviously welcome the ending of the moratorium because we want to see all the benefits to the county. Sorry, in terms of how the wetlands are funded, so essentially it's on a producer pays type mitigation, so they're not meant to tax any development to create things. It's very much to enable development to come forward in the situation we're in. And so we're full cost recovering the cost of the wetlands with the credits to enable us then to go forward and bring funds that money to do more mitigation, to create more headroom, to enable more development, if that makes sense. So at the moment we've delivered Luston, and the credits have been allocated, sold there. I suppose if overnight the moratorium was gone and anyone no longer needed credits, it would undermine the business case by which we're developing that programme, if that makes sense. So, but that programme is there to enable development to come forward with a 20% buffer for river betterment. So we would be able to go so far, but we would then look to other projects, if that makes sense. So am I answering your question? Because I think it is self-funding through the credit income, which is principally how it's taken forward. We have already gone so far, and we've already bought some sites. We're already constructing, and design and build of another one's been awarded. So we'd have to take a review of where we are with that programme, and actually what might we stop or we may not need anymore, because that strategic mitigation might be there in place, or if that strategic mitigation could be there to subsequently fund it in the same way. So it just becomes, our mitigation becomes part of the strategic mitigation. I think that's what we need to look at. Yeah. But we're not quite in that, we haven't got that answer yet. So I suppose it's either if it ended immediately and there was no need at all, then we'd review the programme because it's self-funding and there would be no way to fund it. If the strategic mitigation would enable us to fund it, then we could continue in that way, just using the money diverted through another way. I think we haven't got that definitive answer, is the short answer, but we would look to continue it in that way.
Liz?
Yeah, essentially that. I think we just have to review kind of the position that we were in and determine whether we could invest it into BNG credits or into the wider national or the catchment scale strategic mitigation fund. It would be a conversation to have depending on what came out of government decision.
So the two together, I think, represent quite well.
Could I just come into that? The point I was hoping that we can put is that we believe there's no further grounds for continuing the moratorium. If they don't agree with us, they can come back and explain why. But it's not just a pathway. We want to express the opinion that from the evidence that we have as a council, we don't think there's any justification for continuing the moratorium. And if that can be somehow fitted into this as a pathway or not, and then if they don't agree with us, they can come back and say, well, no, because it's up to them. I can just see a lot of
Pardon?
I can foresee a lot of delay in answering it the way it's going to be phrased. I would like to put them on the spot a little bit more by saying we appear to have reached a point where there's no justification for the moratorium. So can you tell us, how about this then? We appear to have reached a point where there's no further justification for a moratorium. We therefore would like you to tell us what the exit pathway is to end it. Leave it like that.
Well, how are we going to say that then?
What do the rest of your committee think?
Well, I mean, I agree in some ways. I think that was my point. Is that it seems to me that the development have done they've done as much as they can in terms of reducing their own point source pollution. So that's why I think the language needs to be slightly different. It's like, what else can they do, really?
Right. Engage directly with Natural England Environment Agency to achieve the lifting of the housing development moratorium as soon as possible, as a committee believes the evidence is there to support that.
Don't worry about the second bit. You just either make a declaration.
Just make the declaration, okay. I'm being democratic. That's a straight statement now. It doesn't matter whether we need to get into the evidence or not. That's a straight statement. Engage directly with Natural England Environment Agency for the lifting of the housing development moratorium as soon as possible. Okay. Can we move on to the other 5? Because I think those are all right, the rest of them. I think that meets your point.
I like the bit that Daniel took out at the end.
He doesn't want to. We'll compromise.
On the third recommendation, fund additional evidence required to monitor water quality, is it worth returning to our previous recommendation about a SON and whether that should be reconsidered? I mean, it certainly, last time we recommended it, it had the support of the officers, I think, and then somehow didn't get any further. Is it worth pursuing that?
So it was.
Yeah, that, I mean, as a committee, we felt that wasn't a lot of money in terms of the cost of.
I think what the question that comes to my mind is whether or not that is a limiting factor. So you've got, in order to, improve the water quality. I'm not sure that a lack of data is a limiting factor in improving the water quality of the Lug Arran Froome. So it may just be money for no good reason, because we actually have an enormous amount of data. If there's a good argument, and I'm quite happy to go back to Simon and say, is this truly something that is transformative? Then fine. If it's just yet more data in an absolute mountain of data, then it's not a great use of our resources.
Councillor Hayfield?
Yeah, I just wanted to. I asked Andrew, who's bringing all of that citizen science data together directly. He's happy to share, but does he need more help? He did not ask for more help or money at all, and he's happy to share the information that they've got. So I feel a little that, point 3 isn't needed. There wasn't a request, though we did make that point about sharing that, making the YVIS data more publicly accessible, and he made that offer to provide that regular. Summary.
Stay with that point, because I think there's something between us on that one. I mean, it's not. I agree that third one isn't right the way it is, but it seems to me from the debate that wider additional evidence may not be hitting the mark when it comes to natural England or the Environment Agency.
I agree. I can't see any point in number 3.
I agree,
We've
but
got all the evidence we need. We don't need any more.
But there may be a role for the council to push for all the evidence to be considered by Natural England and Environment Agency.
We know that everything in YVIS is being shared with the Environment Agency, and they are using it.
Sorry, Chair, if I can just quickly pop in that the data is being shared. It will inform the plans. As I said to you, the problem that you've got as a catchment partnership, which is bringing forward the holistic plan, is it hasn't got enough. Has got no resource even to exist at the moment. So where I talk about where can the council put in resource to support something that's really critical. More data is not one of those things. Supporting the catchment partnership secretariat might be one of those things, because if we don't, it may not be a thing.
Liz?
I just wanted to go back to the second recommendation, if I can, just to set out that the diffuse water pollution plan is already coming forward with an action plan included within it. So I think the ask is probably to be consulted on the draft version and to ensure that there is funding in place for its implementation. So just slight amendment there.
So you want it to be consulted on?
Consulted on.
Instead of asking for a Pacific, it's to be consulted on.
Yeah.
The diffuse water pollution action plan. Right, so instead of asking for it, it's to be consulted on.
Yes, just as Liz said, they're doing it anyway, so it's a case of can we have early sight of it and the resources, really.
And we have to make clear that that's Herefordshire Council to be consulted on.
Sorry, just on that, we were just saying it would be helpful if the board were consulted, not just the council.
Not just the council.
Yeah, so it'd be shared with the Nutrient Management Board.
So who else should it be?
Nutrient Management Board.
Scrutiny Management Board as well?
Nutrient
Management Board.
Yeah.
So can we call for that as a committee, though?
I guess on behalf of the members of the Nutrient Management Board that are here.
Okay. Right, so as for the consultant,
Yeah.
so it's asking for early consultation for both the council and the Nutrient Management Board members.
Let's get rid of that bit at the beginning there.
Aye, okay.
Also give you a chance to prepare a narrative.
Just about a range and other rivers conference. Just in terms of the evaluation that came out of the rivers conference, does it have the kind of results and impacts? Were you able to measure the outcomes, and is it something that's good to repeat?
That's a really good. I mean, I think it's one of these sort of soft engagement things. So it's quite hard to know what the outcomes are. The fact that there are farmers there, that they sort of spreads good practice. They can talk peer to peer. There's been good press around it. So that gets it out into an even wider world that farmers who didn't attend can sort of hear about it.
Yeah. And I wanted to just pick up on, Mary talked about how important it was that farmers who were actually achieving mitigation in terms of their diffuse water pollution, they get to be acknowledged and celebrated, and whether that's the right forum for that, and whether maybe that should be included.
The reason why I did suggest that was to share all this best practice and share the evidence, specifically on the lug, arrow and foam, and also to talk about these topographical issues that I didn't know about today, about the flow, about the loading, about why this particular subcatchment area is having the problems that it's having. So I would have thought that bringing people together on it is a perfectly good recommendation to have. Okay? Because we learnt stuff today that I certainly didn't know about. If the committee's happy with those four, can we go on to the next three, please?
One moment.
Councillor Proctor?
The final one of these, I did suggest it, but I think it might be a bit operational, and I think it's a good idea, but it probably isn't a committee recommendation, really. So I would propose to delete it.
You want to drop it then?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good idea, but I don't think.
Okay. If committee members are happy with that, we'll drop it then. No. You are a committee member. You're entitled to your view.
So, sorry, going back to the previous page, Daniel, when you finished writing that, the thing about the funding was specifically that once the DWPP is out, there's this specific circumstance that Herefordshire has that we are not benefiting fully from the Water Act because of the relationship with Welsh Water. And so I think that, where's it gone? Yeah, that second point that at the moment mentions funding at the end, I think maybe that funding needs to be moved into a separate point that, yeah, we want that early consultation on the DWPP, and then once it's out, we need that clear understanding of how government funding is coming in to the Nature Recovery Fund and to other funds, because we are suffering from this cross-border issue, devolution issue with Welsh Water.
So yes, we need to engage with government on how the DWPP is going to be funded.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. What do you think, Daniel, about it? We need to give it that extra strength by mentioning that weakness that we are currently under.
I don't think, I'm not one for pleading in recommendations. Just make a recommendation. Don't justify it within the recommendation. That should come in the conversation and the debate and the discussion that's minuted. So
If it's a consolation, it will certainly be picked up in the minutes. And the minutes is a record of what we've discussed at this committee. So people can react to the minutes by saying, oh, look, we did discuss that. What's happened to it? So that it won't be lost because it will be picked up. If we're all right with those, Ben, right.
just a plea for myself on the last recommendation there. I think the intention is to prioritise the processing of private mitigations, because as written it kind of implies that they're not being done properly, and I think that's unfair. So I think if you're asking to prioritise them, I'd probably reword that as prioritise. Does that make sense?
This is on the
I think as written it sort of implies that they're not being done, which I don't believe is the case. Well, it's not the case. I think if the ask is to prioritise them, then I would just be clear on that.
Councillor Highfield on this point, and then I'll bring Councillor Highfield.
Yeah, very quick. I get the explanation you gave earlier. The problem appears to be the bureaucratic loopholes that you need to go through in order to get these things approved. And is it possible to approach the agencies that create these bureaucratic requirements to say that maybe these could be streamlined? Could we ask them to streamline the requirements so that, or urge that they adopt that national thing that you described that might short circuit it anyway, one or the other?
Joe, your meeting's about to finish.
Do we need to vote on an extension? Do we?
I mean, we could. Yeah, I think it is the strategic ones that we feel will make a difference. Sorry.
We will need to vote in an extension committee before. I would suggest an extra 15 minutes just to finish off this debate and the agenda. All those in favour? That's okay. Right. Sorry, Liz, if you want to continue.
Yeah, so I think the strategic, those planning applications that are of a strategic nature that can make a difference, particularly around kind of the poultry waste and so on, those might be where our focus is. And also we could reiterate our request to central government to be part of that pilot scheme and to put pressure on to kind of bring that forward. That's the national scheme that you're talking about with the Nature Restoration Fund.
Do we need to change the recommendation then?
Maybe Daniel could add a couple of words that makes that support for the national scheme, reiterate
So we want to change it then?
Reiterate our request to be part of the national scheme. Something like that. Can that be fitted in somehow?
No idea which recommendation you're talking about. Which one are you referring to?
So for the last one on the list there, prioritise the processing of strategic planning applications. And reiterate the request to MHCLG to participate as a pilot in the Nature Restoration Fund scheme.
Prioritise the processing of planning applications.
Strategic planning.
And
Reiterate.
support the request from Herefordshire to be part of the pilot for the national scheme.
And to support, you have to, I'm not clear what you're asking here.
Right.
Could you repeat what you're asking here?
Prioritise the processing, take prompt out,
Yes, I've done that.
take prompt out.
Why is that not shown on the screen?
It's that one, it's the fourth one.
Yes, I know, but I'm not sure why.
Fifth one.
Yes, I'm not sure if it's shown on the screen.
Take prompt out.
I think I know why. One moment.
Is it not working?
Hold on. Just a moment.
Can you not change it then?
Yeah,
No.
just a moment.
Okay. What?
Let's down.
And I'll bring in Councillor Heathfield, but prioritise the process and, yeah, that one, the fifth one.
Before planning.
Pardon?
You're missing the word strategic before planning.
It's just not updating. He's making the changes, but it's not updating.
Yeah, it's not updated.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
Technology is letting us down, Richard.
So the PowerPoint's frozen.
Gary, for a big umbrella.
It's still not working.
No, it's fine now.
Okay, good.
So you've got prioritise. We've lost the link to the
Correct.
the fact that it's to do with private mitigation.
I'm afraid you've lost that now. So what is it you want to do out there?
Pardon?
You want to prioritise the process?
Prioritise the process of strategic planning applications, but it was strategic planning applications relating to the private mitigation of
Moment.
nutrients.
It was which mitigate, which I can't remember what the words were. But in fact, Liz, her recommendation didn't have those words in it. What Liz had suggested.
So Liz got a recommendation, yes.
Oh, just sending it through directly to Daniel, just to write up.
Yeah, good idea.
Thank you.
So you're going to give us forwards. While Liz is doing that, Councillor Heathfield, I think you had a point to raise, didn't you?
I cut and pasted it and I lost it.
I promise is the final thing from me. Water protection zone. So you brought it up. We've been asking for it for a long time. Are we now deciding that sort of the DWPP is kind of taking over from the water protection zone? So we're stopping talking about it, or do we still just want to reiterate that remains our ambition?
It's still council policy, so we haven't changed, no.
No. So have we potentially got a recommendation saying council needs to remember that?
We've got one already about a
Okay,
glide path
leave it
towards
be
a
then.
water protection zone for the
Okay.
Y. We've got that from
Good.
previous ones. I don't know if we've had we have had a response, haven't we? And we had and I engaged with you on that one, I think, council swing us. But yes, it's still council policy, yes. While we're waiting for this to happen, on item 8, the work programme, I've agreed with Daniel, and I hope Justine can make it as well, that Justine, myself and Daniel will have a planning meeting on populating the rest of the work programme for 25-26, and we'll bring that back to the committee, hopefully for the next meeting in March. Is everyone happy with that? Yes? Because I think if we get our heads together and put forward a set of proposals. But having said that, if any of you have any candidates you want us to consider for the rest of the year, for the work programme beyond September, then by all means do fire an email to Daniel to let us know what that topic is. Okay? Right.
Bear with me a moment. Sorry, my system is failing rapidly.
And that clears item 8, and then what I will do, I'll just go forward to say when the next meeting is, and I'll close the meeting after that. Okay. Right, can we move on to the next page now? And look at the last two, please.
Excuse me, Chair.
Last two.
Yes, one moment, Chair.
Do we need to be more specific for those being about this sub-catchment area? Or is that wider points that the committee want to make? Councillor Highfield and then
Just
Councillor Proctor.
that first one there, it could be worded much more simply, identify best practice in other areas.
I don't think that's quite
Is that
the
not
same.
the same?
No.
It's not the same?
It's a good idea, but it's not the same. I think the fact that the recommendations are specifically linked to river lug water quality is probably sufficient context.
Okay. Yeah. Right.
Sorry to, I'm going to be a pain again, but nutrient neutrality isn't catchment recovery. So nutrient neutrality is what you do to kind of tread water, stay where you are. But that last point, I think what you mean is how do we get beyond neutrality and back into recovery? So it'd be like a restoration type move as opposed to neutrality. Which
So you want more than nutrient
better.
neutrality, you want catchment recovery.
Well, I don't know, it's up to Liz and Ben really, probably better, but nutrient neutrality just means staying as bad as we are.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you happy? Are you content?
Yeah.
Right, so we've got two votes to take now. First of all,
I need to read these out.
Pardon?
Now I need to read them out.
Oh, you're going to read them out?
Yeah.
Okay, right.
For the benefit of those watching online. The Environment Sustainability Scrutiny Committee on the 20th of January 2025 proposes the following recommendations concerning river lug water quality. That the Executive should do the following. Engage directly with Natural England and the Environment Agency to achieve the lifting of the housing development moratorium as soon as possible. Ask for early consultation with Herefordshire Council and the Nutrient Management Board on a specific diffuse water pollution plan for the Lug and its tributaries, the Arrow and the Froome. Engage with Government to ensure adequate funding for actions on the diffuse water pollution plan. Arrange another Rivers Conference focusing on the Lug, Arrow and Froome. Prioritise processing of strategic planning applications to progress private mitigation and to reiterate the request to the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government to participate in the pilot scheme for the development of the Nature Restoration Fund. Invest with partners in a specific innovation process to consider approaches that have been successful in different locations or sectors and identified new approaches worth testing in the nutrients management context. And finally, with partners, identify key outcomes that will indicate the success of actions to move towards river restoration and agree how these will be collected and reported.
Thank you, Scrutiny Officer. We have two votes to take. The first vote is, are we happy to take these recommendations on block?